Ontem tava dando erro, aí eu tava indo pro YouTube errado. E, então, deixa assim, quando ele entrar, você arrasta pra lá. Primeiro, ele vai ser o primeiro quando você for ele. Eu vou deixar ele com o PIN. Vou deixar ele com. Aí depois você pode tira o PIN e bota no site. Ele vai. Cai. Quando quiser, a gente pode começar.
Hannah, we're live. We're good.
Oh, we're starting.
And my turn.
Good morning. My name is Michaela Bapa. I am Director of Research and Physical Research Scientist at MIT Center of International Studies. This is our second day of the conference and our first panel for the day.
Closer.
Yes.
Talk closer to the microphone.
Yes.
Yes.
Better?
Yes.
This is our panel on global health. And we are delighted to have today with us 4 panelists. So please allow me to introduce them. First, I would like to introduce Paolo Marchiori Bus. Is a physician and former president of the Osvaldo Cruz Foundation. He holds a master's degree in social medicine from the State University of Rio de Janeiro and a PhD in sciences from the Global Health and Sustainability Program at the School of Public Health, University of Sao Paulo. He's the director of the Center for International Relations in Health and a full member of the Brazilian National Academy of Medicine. His main fields of work include global health, health diplomacy, cooperation in health, and the intersections between health and international relations. Our second panelist is Mirko Heinzel. Mirko Heinzel is an assistant professor at Maastricht University and an affiliate of the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. His research on global health, including questions of expertise, inequalities in staff representation, and global south, has been published in many international relations journals. Now, the third panelist is Carolina Salgado. Carolina Salgado is an assistant professor at the Institute of International Relations of PUC, and she holds PhD from PUC, and she spent 4 years conducting her doctoral research in Germany. She was an associate researcher at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies in Hamburg. She carried out postdoctoral research at the intersection of public and international policy, with an emphasis on international cooperation. She currently serves as the coordinator of the Foreign Policy Analysis Working Group at the Brazilian International Relations Association for the 2023-2025 term. And she conducts research on global health and foreign policy analysis. Our final panelist is Pedro Vilardi, who is the global coordinator for health equity at Public Services International. He holds a bachelor's degree from PUC, a master's degree in bioethics, applied ethics, and collective health, and a PhD in human sciences and health from the Institute of Social Medicine at UERJ. Between 2012 and 2022, he coordinated the working group on intellectual property. His research focuses on topics such as global health and essential medicines and global pharmaceutical production. He's working mainly on issues related to intellectual property, medicines, access, pharmaceutical patents, and public health. So this is a very, very distinguished panel with a lot of health expertise, and we plan to have 15 minutes of presentations by each panelist, and then we will open for questions. So without further ado, we will start in the order of the program. So please, Paolo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Are you ready, V?
One moment.
Are you ready, V? Okay. So I continue here. Well,
Tá saindo na pole. Sim, tá saindo na pole. Troca aí.
sorry for to be
We're working
online.
on
One moment. Volta lá. Não, volta para o Zoom. Eu posso botar na pole e ficar com o microfone. Não, aqui. Com o telefone. Vai lá no microfone. Não dá para enxergar. Puxa para cá. Pera aí. Aqui tá saindo. Bota nesse. Bota pra lá.
Maybe now.
You can
Eu acho que
you can talk.
Please go ahead.
Ask to Paulo to.
On the table.
Can I
Yeah.
go ahead?
Não, já tá saindo.
Are you ready, V?
Try to speak up.
Mas tá saindo agora por cima, não tá? Tá
We
saindo
always
aí
have
no projetor.
problems with this high-tech technology, unfortunately.
We can change a gente pode mudar a ordem rapidinho enquanto a gente resolve isso?
Just change the order.
All right, so let us start with
Avisa
our
ele pelo
second
chat que a gente vai.
posters. Please.
Eu vou tirar ele aqui. Do microfone. Microphone. Ok. Vou pôr os slides dele já. Is that?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for organizing, for having us here. So chances are in the last couple of years, many of you have seen headlines like the ones next slide, please. The ones you see on the screen now, or might see on the screen in a minute. The headlines basically describe all sorts of problems the WHO faced during the COVID pandemic. So you had allegations of delayed response, allegations of coddling to China, allegations of population control. Gabriel Milei of Argentina left the World Health Organization recently, accusing it of the biggest attempt of social engineering ever orchestrated. Donald Trump very famously left the WHO as well. The WHO has really been criticized for everything from being the all-powerful force behind a global attempt at controlling everybody to being completely useless in the face of a global pandemic. And what I'm trying today is to basically talk about the main two problems that people have identified after the pandemic, how people have tried to address them, and what consequences these attempts at reforms might have had for the sort of democratic nature of global governance, the robustness of global governance, and the effectiveness of global governance, which are the three main concepts that the Insured Project is using to analyze different types of reforms. There's essentially, next slide, please. There's essentially two main problems that the World Health Organization has faced or that have been identified and need for reform. The first is sort of misaligned and insufficient finance. For decades, the WHO's core budget was effectively frozen under a zero nominal growth policy. So basically, countries agreed that there wouldn't be any increases in the assessed contributions to the WHO, which means that the WHO's resources are lacking far behind of what would be necessary to address this mandate of making us all healthy in every single country. If you compare the resources the WHO has as a whole, that's roughly as much as a middle-sized hospital in London. So obviously that is sort of a resourcing shortfall of quite remarkable proportion. At the same time, the way money is given to the WHO has also been sort of discussed quite extensively. So the WHO, because of this policy of zero nominal growth, has relied extensively on voluntary contributions. So more than 75% normally, sometimes substantially more than that. And most of them are highly earmarked voluntary contributions. So earmarking essentially means that donors predetermine what the money can be spent. So that leaves very limited flexibility for priority setting, and also earmarking typically comes with all sorts of obligations of reporting, so filling out loads of forms and demonstrating what the money has done, and all these things raise transaction costs and limit the ability of the WHO to respond flexibly to global pandemics, which is kind of a problem because that's kind of a main thing of what they're supposed to do. The second thing that was sort of identified as a main problem during the pandemic was that the central way in which the WHO can address situations like the COVID pandemic is through the international health regulations, and they are sort of a remarkable piece of an agreement in global health, and they do give the WHO a range of powers, but these powers were not enough. So the COVID pandemic basically exposed failures in national reporting. The WHO wasn't necessarily able to get countries to report on time and in accordance to the agreement. There was some criticism over a slow declaration of a health emergency of international concern. And there was also a range of trade and travel restrictions, especially, for example, imposed on South Africa when the Omicron variant sort of became or came out, I guess, that violated the core principles of the international health regulations. So these are the problems. What have we done to try to address them? So we think that these problems essentially undermine a range of the concepts that we're trying to look at in the short term. So in terms of financing, the reliance on voluntary earmark contribution undermines democracy because it allows donors to sort of dictate particular priorities they have, sort of sidestepping the main decision-making process within the organization. That undermines robustness because you can't really predict how long this funding will be there, and it undermines effectiveness. So research has shown that these transaction costs place them quite a burden on international bureaucracies and make them less able to fulfill their mandates. The problems with the international health regulations, there's not really sort of a lot of discussion on how they might undermine democracy at the global level, but they have sort of consequences for both robustness and effectiveness. Robustness, seeing as countries saw it necessary to sidestep this process, and effectiveness as it was not able to sort of act in a timely manner, at least in the eyes of many commentators. Okay, so can we go next slide?
Next.
And next slide, and next. Further, please. Okay, so essentially, there's a range of reforms that that people have done on finance. So the most important shift has been the gradual increase of assessed contributions. So basically, countries have agreed that there's a need to finance the WHO in a more sustainable way. The first is just sort of countries pledging to increase assessed contributions. But there's also a range of sort of more institutional reforms that try to make that happen. Two notable examples are the WHO Foundation, which allow it to raise financing from individuals and sort of other private donors. And the second is the investment round, which is essentially a replenishment round negotiations where every couple of years a country comes together and negotiates sort of a predictable amount of funding for the next years. And we think that this sort of both of these tools do some work in increasing the robustness of the WHO. So it allows the WHO to sort of have more predictable funding and work with that. At the same time, we also all know that the US left the World Health Organization. So this is obviously not part of the reform process, but it's an outside factor that massively impacts the WHO. The US has contributed a substantial amount of WHO funding, and that funding is not going away. In terms of effectiveness, we also think that the more flexible funding can strengthen the WHO's ability to deliver on its mandate. But again, it's not sort of sufficient to match the expectations that are there on the WHO to really stop global pandemics and safeguard human health around the globe. There's also some questions on how the WHO Foundation might affect democratic decision making, because there's less sort of transparency on where that money is coming from than through the normal standard funding. Okay. So who won and who lost in the negotiations over funding? So the WHO Secretariat to some extent won in these negotiations because they got promises for reforms to change the way they have been financed for the 40, 50 years before. But at the same time, next slide, please. At the same time, it still faces major shortfalls after the US withdrawal. At the same time, the EU and supporters of sort of strong core funding, they also won in sort of getting this on the agenda, but voluntary funds remain highly earmarked. It's still sort of majority of funding comes from voluntary. In terms of China, so we have additional voluntary pledges by China over the next couple of years, which is going to give China more influence in the institution. And also some leverage, because some of these pledges are not completely defined as whether they're additional to what China has been spending previously, or whether they are including what they have been spending previously, which is some constructive ambiguity that they might be able to use in future negotiations. And low and middle income countries, again, there's some additional funding for country work, but that is offset by the cuts to the US leaving the institution. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, second type of reform, the international health regulations, and specifically the pandemic agreement, which is supposed to address some of the shortcomings that were identified in these regulations. Next slide, please. So basically, COVID exposed a range of gaps and structural limitations in the international health regulations. And so people sort of discussed whether they should reform the international health regulations, which was more the US position, or whether they should create a pandemic agreement, which was spearheaded, among others, by the European Union. Ultimately, the side that wanted a new pandemic agreement under Article 19 of the WHO, so an agreement that needs to be ratified by countries, won out. And it sort of, the negotiations happened in an area of intense contestation, right? You had a lot of conspiracy theories spreading. The WHO was in the news like it had never been before. And sort of that was the backdrop along these, along what these negotiations were happening. So next slide, please. So what do we get? Essentially, there's sort of two, you can categorize the actors who negotiated into two broad factions. The one is the African Inequity Group, which is a large amount of low and middle income countries. There's two separate groups, but there was some overlap in the two groups. And they were pushing for binding commitments on benefit sharing. So this addresses the key problem identified during the pandemic. The key problem was there wasn't enough vaccines distributed to low and middle income. The idea of this pathogen access and benefit sharing is essentially that countries who share their pathogens get a commitment in return by pharmaceutical companies to give around 20% of their pandemic-related products to countries in the low-income countries specifically. So 10% of that would be donations, and 10% of that would be allowing them to purchase these. And basically, in return, what pharmaceutical companies get is early access to pathogens. Currently, one of the problems during the pandemic was that sharing pathogens was disincentivized, as the example of South Africa and Omicron showed, right? Because you showed that there was a new variant, you don't want to share that pathogen because you might have to pay a lot of costs because everybody's sort of shutting down your flights and your products. The G7 Plus got sort of a flexible, mixed binding, non-binding treaty, and the focus on the One Health approach, including both human health, animal health, and so on, which they care a lot. So we think that this pandemic agreement creates a globally binding framework that has key benefit sharing commitments, although these commitments are currently still undefined. Basically, the agreement is waiting for an annex to be negotiated that really specifies this key component of the agreement, and a lot hinges on what will be included in that annex. So a lot is still sort of out in the open on whether countries are able to design a sort of effective way to do this benefit sharing. There's also some level of preservance of cooperation. At the same time, was the lowest common denominator agreement, right? There was sort of more sweeping reforms were not really possible to realize at the time. In terms of democracy, we think there's some positives in terms of the process because it allows countries to boost legitimacy through ratification. So you need to actually ratify, which is contrast with the international health regulations, which was adopted by the World Health Assembly. But it doesn't really change how democracy looks for the whole time. And we go to the final slide, which is the table. So a couple more slides down. Yeah. So what changed in the end? We think that there are some positive changes for financing. So financing reforms increase robustness and effectiveness, but at the same time, you have the US withdrawing, which sort of undermines all of these factors as well. And we think that the pandemic treaty gives some positive boosts to robustness and effectiveness. There's not a lot of change on the dimension of democracy, and a lot is still out on the details on how this agreement will be negotiated. So thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to it.
Moving to our next panelist, Carolina Salgado. The floor is yours.
You want to go back maybe to
Yeah, the last is better.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, please. Hey. So thank you for the organizers, for the invitation, all of you, including my students, and thank you for coming. So in order to take full advantage of the 16 minutes, I want to take my time. I'm going to read these few words for you. So this discussion aims to exchange our perspectives on the efforts of multilateral institutions to address political concerns in global health. In order to prepare myself, I reviewed recent interviews, essays on journalist platforms, academic analysis, scientific events, and podcasts, all mainly from Brazil, to identify the main questions and interests expressed by civil society organizations and the media regarding these efforts. In this brief survey, I also sought to identify one or two themes that seem to be implied or even only tangentially mentioned in the lines of these long answers and reflections published. From the perspective of multilateralism, it has become very clear that the greatest interest over the last 2 years was centered on the G20 and BRICS, largely due to Brazil's rotating presidents of the G20 in 2024 and the BRICS in 2025. Although there are not formal institutions, but rather forums for dialogue and cooperation, both are highly relevant to our discussion today. Among the recurring questions about health cooperation, vaccine production, pandemic preparedness, neglect, and socially determined disease, among many other topics, one issue stood out to me, although it's still underexplored. This issue is the financing of global health.
Within this topic, what seems most superficially addressed is the so-called commercial dimension of the social determinants of health, or commercial determinants of health as it is defined in the academic literature. Therefore, that concept and the analytical model developed from it to understand its implications for global health financing will be the focus of my discussion here today. To begin, I will show how global health financing has appeared in the most recent multilateral discussions of the G20 and the BRICS. The Joint Finance in Health Task Force of the G20 and the Partnership for the Elimination of Socially Determined Disease, approved in the 2025 BRICS Leaders Summit Declaration, will be my starting point. The Joint Finance and Health Task Force was conceived in 2021 as a forum to strengthen global dialogue and cooperation on pandemic preparedness, prevention, and response, aligned with the One Health approach and the WHO priorities. Composed of the finance and health ministers of the G20 members, it articulates public and multilateral investments in public health, addressing sustainable health system financing, pandemic preparedness, and social determinants of health. Its 2024 joint declaration highlights three priorities. First, unpacking the centrality of financing initiatives aimed at the social determinants of health. Two, increasing resource mobilization for health, protect for health, and three, improving assessment of global health, social, and economic vulnerability. This way, we clearly perceive the focus of this task force revolving around financing initiatives for the social determinants of health and resource mobilization strategies. These ministers also mentioned the global report on the framework for health, social, and economic vulnerability risk, FAVR in the acronym, which was created at the request of this task force. The FAVR is an international reference framework with 23 indicators measuring vulnerabilities across health, social, and economic domains. The report explains that analysis to better understand how and why countries are so vulnerable to macroeconomic impacts of pandemic risks were initiated under India's G20 president in 2022 and evolved into the FAVR framework. It links health system resilience, macroeconomic stability, and socioeconomic protection to diagnosis vulnerability. The report concludes by stating that, and I quote, given the collective risk posed by pandemics, it's essential to continue to assess the progress to reduce the estimated $10.5 billion financing gap in pandemic preparedness and the measures to significantly increase funding available. Close quotes. Under Brazil's presidency in 2024, the focus was to qualitatively refine this framework in order to better capture the interlinked nature of social, fiscal, and emergency vulnerabilities across low and middle income countries. As with many consensus-based and non-binding instruments, this 2024 G20 declaration focuses on diagnosis and recommendations too. Yet, in between the lines, it lies a critique that the relationship between economy and health through the lens of commercial determinants expose the conflicting interests among the actors involved, which are transnational corporations on the one side and governments responsible for public policies on the other. Turning to BRICS, the Partnership for the Elimination of Socially Determined Disease, which was approved in its 2025 Summit Declaration, was one of 8 priorities chosen by Brazil's president. Inspired by our program called Programa Brasil Saudável, that was launched in February 2024, it seeks to eliminate disease often absent from wealthy nations' research agenda, what we call disease of poverty, such as tuberculosis, leprosy, malaria, dengue, and yellow fever. The BRICS initiative aims to mobilize resources and strengthen South-South cooperation to tackle this disease, whose incidence is aggravated by what they identified as barriers to health access. Once again, we see that there is a strong concern at the multilateral level regarding the commercial dimension, which conditions access to the first and more fundamental human rights, which is the right to life. Signatory countries commit to reinforcing community health systems, addressing social and environmental determinants, expanding R&D collaboration, and advocating for the removal of those financial barriers. The ability to consolidate health sovereignty among these countries is evident, stemming from the impossibility of relying on traditional North-South cooperation to promote innovative solutions adapted to local realities. And financial barriers are recognized, mentioning financial institutions, donors, and the private sectors as agents that need to engage in this partnership. So, what exactly are these barriers mentioned by the BRICS? And what are the commercial determinants of health that strongly impact the G20 FABR indicators? The term commercial determinants of health was popularized by Ilona Kickbush, Luke Allen, and Christian Franz in an article published in 2016 in The Lancet, defining it as strategies and approaches used by the private sector to promote products and choices that are strongly detrimental to health. These strategies include both individual behaviors related to consumption and lifestyle, and broader systemic issues such as global political economy and globalization. These authors explain that the commercial determinants of health generated by the internationalization of market and capital, the growth of demands, and expansion of the reach of corporations are just harming the environment, consumers, and health. Since health outcomes are determined by the influence of this corporation in the space where people live, work, and circulate, the harm is done particularly through the availability of unhealthy products at very affordable prices. In 2022, Pan American Health Organization launched the Knowledge Showcase on the commercial dimension of the social determinants of health. On its website, experts state that the commercial dimension can compromise health and the environment when corporate practices or commercial interests seek to undermine effective public policies to maximize profits and commercial advantage. The dynamics of this commercial dimension can deepen social inequalities on income, power, and resources, weakening governments and states and their institutional capacity to implement effective policy. More recently, in March 2023, the first in a series of articles by The Lancet was published, updating the research on the commercial determinants of health. In this article, the authors explain that the concept describes how the shift towards market fundamentalism and increasingly powerful transnational corporations has created a pathological system in which commercial actors are ever more enabled to cause harm and externalizing the costs of doing so. The 21 experts who authored this paper representing all continents and all regions in the world are emphatic. There is a growing evidence that the products and practices of some commercial actors, notably the largest transnational corporations, are the responsible for the rising rates of preventable health problems, planetary harm, and social and health inequalities. They continue with what is most alarming. Only 4 industrial sectors known as the unhealthy commodity industry, tobacco, ultra-processed foods, processed foods, and alcohol are already responsible for at least 1/3 of all global health deaths. Up to this point, my argument can be summarized very clear. The influence of this corporation over consumers, though the widespread through the widespread availability and affordability of unhealthy products, combined with corporate practices and commercial interests aimed at weakening effective public policy, just to maximize their profits, undermine the government's capacity to implement effective measures that reduce social, economic, and health inequities. This constitutes a market fundamentalism that produces a pathological system in which commercial actors are increasingly empowered to inflict harm while externalizing the resulting costs to governments and society. At the center of the system lies the unhealthy commodity industries, which I will discuss in a moment. And how do these commercial determinants operate globally? The Lancet authors respond to products and practices such as exploiting legal, regulatory standards and low and middle income countries. For example, pharmaceuticals and pesticides banned in high-income countries are exported to low and middle-income countries, along with toxic waste. Since the 70s, the unhealthy commodity industry has been shown to extract income disproportionately and externalize their harms to countries of the global south. Also transfer wealth to a small elite of shareholders and institutional investors. To illustrate this process, the authors developed a conceptual model on the commercial determinants of health, emphasizing that 1. Commercial entities must bear the true costs of the harm they cause. 2. Governments must exercise their power to hold these entities accountable. And 3. Norms must be reshaped in accordance with the public interest. Here we find 2 essential points for interpreting the concerns and initiatives of the G20 and BRICS mentioned earlier. The first is, how can multilateral norms be recreated in line with the governmental duty to protect people's health and life? And 2, how can corporations be made to bear the costs of the damage they inflict? Analyzing the official documents that I cited before, and aligning with what civil society organizations and public health research have highlighted, it is striking that there are no concrete measures directly addressing these 2 points. In other words, we are witnessing the completely absence of strategies to confront the negative externalities of unhealthy product industries, as well as of initiatives to reform the investment norms and regulatory currently shaped by these commercial elites. Thus, if financial barriers are recognizing, focus on the private sectors, what do we know about the world's largest unhealthy commodity industry? So here we go, just to conclude. This corporation operates through a clear neoliberal geopolitical logic. The headquarters where profits are channeled and where brand marketing strategies are defined to encourage consumption, as well as the definition of the use of technology, all these are concentrated in the United States, United Kingdom, France, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. However, the production of these commodities takes place mainly in Brazil, India, China, Indonesia, and other countries on a smaller scale, such as Indonesia, Zimbabwe, and Argentina. It's also to these southern countries that massive investments in lobbying and advertising are directed to ensure the consumption of these unhealthy products among local populations. Since, as we have seen, in many high-income countries, such consumption is just banned. Lastly, as these are extremely wealthy corporations with great influence over multilateral trade, they also intervene decisively in the definition of norms and regulations within their respective sectors, exempting themselves from any responsibility regarding their negative externalities on the environment and on public health. As stated in the Lancet article, although externalities can be addressed through fiscal measures, transnational corporations have been very successful in using their financial and political practice to reduce the various tax obligations and obtain state subsidies. Effective tax rates even of the most harmful transnational corporations, have steadily declined since the 70s. And the Tax Justice Network estimates that corporations transfer 40% of all profits earned abroad to tax havens. We are talking about corporations such as the following: Philip Morris from the US, British American Tobacco from the UK, Johnny Walker, Smirnoff and Guinness from the UK, Heineken from the Netherlands, Pernod Ricard from France, Nestlé from Switzerland, Coca-Cola Pepsi from the US, Unilever from the UK, Danone from France, ExxonMobil and Chevron from the US, Shell from the UK, Cargill from the US, and Crisayana from France. Their largest consumer markets are Bangladesh, Brazil, Pakistan, Mexico, Romania, India, China, Nigeria, Vietnam, and South Africa. The exception regarding consumer countries is the United States itself, where there are fewer growth epidemics of chronic non-communicable diseases such as obesity, cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, and mental disorders. The technological profile of the United States reflects the hegemony of the unhealthy commodity industries, since its health system, privatized and commercialized, focus more on disease management than on prevention. To conclude, I will go to the two questions posed in light of the G20 and the BRICS multilateral declaration and initiatives mobilized here. How can corporations be made to clear the costs of the negative externalities of their operations? And how can multilateral norms be reshaped to serve government's duties to protect people's health rather than just commercial interests of a small global elite? Thank you. Thank you.
Now, our third panelist, Pedro Hernandez. The floor is yours.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Pedro. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. I am a graduate student from PUC, from Rio. It's been a while since I graduated, but it's always good to come back home, and I feel very welcome here. So, yeah, it's very good to be here. And also, Andrea was my teacher a while ago, a couple of days ago. Also Kai, and I'm very happy to be here. So currently, I'm working on Public Services International. It's a global union federation that represents over 30 million workers worldwide. And 60% out of those 30 million are health and care workers. And I'm responsible for the health sector here in Interamerica, from Canada to Argentina or Chile, depending where I am. I'd say Argentina or Chile. I would like to bring here some reflections on the current state of global health and share some perspectives on the INB process, the pandemic trade negotiation process, which was mentioned here. I'll start with the transition from the international health area to the global health area in the 90s. We had pretty much state-centric governance system, but there was already tensions both from east and west and north and south, north and south. From the 90s, we had the neoliberal hegemony, and we saw the funding of health systems. We saw a huge increase on the privatization trends. And we saw the emergence of what we call the multi-stakeholder arena. And there was a range of actors coming into the global health arena, challenging the centrality of the state. And also, as Carolina was mentioning, and also my colleague Mirko, the entry of those huge corporations more in a legitimate way into the conversations. Like if there was a huge table and everyone had a stake on it, like everyone had a voice, and as if that was a democratic way of solving things. Instead of understanding that there was state with the legitimacy from coming from democracy and corporations with private interests that should be regulated and not the other way around. Along with that, we had a current tension of approaches that were reflected both in the World Health Organization, but also within countries, which was a tension between vertical approaches and also against a more strengthening of health systems and a more what we call horizontal approach, which was a way to fund health systems, improve the capacity of a state and a country to answer to crisis and promote health of their population instead of vertical campaigns such as malaria elimination. Of course, everyone's pro eliminating malaria, but this is not the case. It's about an ability of a country to fight malaria regardless of a very specific intervention, mainly come from philanthropic or foundations. And here is another trend of the global health area, which is the philanthrocapitalism, right? This is within the framework of the multi-stakeholderism and indicates a lack of democracy in terms of the global health area. So I'd like to share like 3 episodes that I was part of, and I think that reflects what I'm trying to say for the last couple of minutes. And one of them was during the executive board of the WHO this year, in February this year, almost last year now, right? When a few months after the US announced that they would withdraw from the WHO, and that was followed by attacks by other countries in the WHO, at the WHO. So Argentina, Hungary, Israel, they were very, how do you say, I could say violent in their statements, which is very atypical when considering a diplomatic space such as the executive board of the WHO, like attacking like things that Mirko was sharing earlier. And that was very odd to everyone there. That kind of violence, that kind of non-diplomatic language within the executive board, that sounded very, and that was followed, of course, by the reform of the USA from the WHO. Argentina, I can say if they already left or not. Hungary was saying that they might left, Israel the same, and Israel, in fact, they kidnapped the agenda. I mean, using all the ways they could to extend the discussion because there were 2 resolutions on health at the Gaza Strip, including rebuilding hospitals and protecting health and care workers. So yes, I was very interested in those resolutions because we had members that died in the, I can say conflict, I'm sorry, the genocide at the Gaza Strip. We're very interested in the discussion took hours because Israel went in a vote and then they don't want to vote and all the tactics to delay the discussions and do not vote the agenda that would be on the WHO's agenda later in May this year. So that was one that shows that this combination of extreme right and multi-stakeholderism is really derailing the multilateral system as we know it. And this is something that really calls the attention and I mean, it lights the yellow light, right? So if we must think the multilateral system as something that is still useful and still important for countries, especially from the global south, and for civil society organizations, there is an agenda and a campaign to dismantle it as we know it, to defund it, and to reduce the democracy within the multilateral system, especially in the global health governance. And the second thing I wanted to share is about the pandemic treaty negotiations. There was an international negotiating body, the INB. I'm going to refer to it as such. The INB. It was a decrease in the democracy status of the WHO, because so far all the negotiations were with the doors open. So people could be inside the room, listen to what countries were defending, listen to what countries were trying to include and exclude from the text being negotiated. And that was not the case during the pandemic treaty negotiations. Non-state actors were only allowed in the room for very specific times, and not to listen to countries, but to make their statements, which is of course important, but we couldn't know what each country was defending in terms of the text of the treaty. So we would receive, I was there in several negotiating sessions, and by the end of the day, we would receive a consolidated text with some marks in yellow and blue, and the yellow parts were not consensus. The blue part was an attempt by the Secretariat to reach a consensus, but we couldn't know what the African group trying to include. We didn't know what the CELAC group was trying to include. We didn't know what the EU was defending. We didn't know anything. We were completely in the dark until there was a leak, and a tax retributions leaked, and we could see what countries were defending actually, but that was once. There was another leak, and there is an important decrease in the democracy of the global health governance system. Either way, we could see the tensions between North and South, and this is persistent. It's a persistent element from the 70s until currently, until today. And talking about the extreme right and the electrocapitalism trends in the WHO, there were huge demonstrations during the pandemic treaty negotiations, during the World Health Assembly. I mean, buses in Geneva saying no pandemic treaty, no globalism, and that was the global extreme right trying to derail the negotiations, saying that it was an attack to the sovereignty of the countries. And if we're going to talk about the financial capitalism, after the US left the WHO, currently the largest funder of the WHO is the Gates Foundation. Not a country, it's a foundation. And who controls the foundation, right? So again, we have the tension between horizontal approaches and vertical approaches, because the Gates Foundation is very much pro direct campaigns to eliminate this and eliminate that, but not a core funder of, and that was Mirko was saying, the earmarked contributions. It does not go to a core budget, but it's a very earmarked thing. And just to wrap up, talking about the PUC's negotiation, the pathogen access and benefit sharing system that Mirko was also mentioning. I think here the North and South tension is very clear. And it's very clear because it has to be understood along with the surveillance chapter article of the pandemic treaty system. So whereas the global North countries, especially the EU, are trying to push for very hard and binding surveillance measures, early warning system, changing the way countries do the surveillance in terms of disease. Global South countries are trying to have binding conditions on the access to the actual technologies that would fight the next health emergency, right? And this surveillance logic to have early warning systems, so on and so forth, it goes back to the 19th century, right? In the 1800s, that was exactly what the colonial powers were trying to implement in their colonies. So it's a trend that comes from 200 years, and we still see a colonial logic within the negotiations from the European Union, especially talking about Latin America and the African Union countries. So just to say my last words, the PAC system is being negotiated this week. There is a negotiation session this week going on. And I just, WhatsApp groups, there are popping messages all day long. And I just heard news that although the US is not in the room, they are making it very clear that if there is any binding conditions in terms of access to health technologies in the PAC's annex that's being negotiated now, the countries can forget about global health aid, which is kind of odd because they should have forgotten by now because there's no global health aid anymore for a number of months. But this is the message that the US, although not in the room, sent to the countries that are trying to push for binding measures. And of course, they want binding measures on the sharing of pathogens, which is what will likely happen and will put the global South countries in a vulnerable situation, given what happened to South Africa when they released to the world that they could map the genetic system of Omicron. So for public health or for public services international, the multilateral system is still very important. We still follow PAHO, we still follow WHO, we still follow the ILO, because we believe this is a democratic, those are democratic spaces that should be valued. And we also see the current moment as an opportunity for global South countries to reclaim the protagonism on those spaces like the G77 and the non-aligned movement did in the 70s. So maybe this is an opportunity, and Public Services International will keep occupying this space as a non-state actor in official relations with the future. Thank you.
Let's try to bring in our virtual panelists now.
You ask him actively to
Turn on you can say something. I think you are muted. Could you please try to unmute yourself and say something so that we can check if the sound works?
Are you ready, B? We have a problem already. Well, I can send my presentation. I don't know if it solves the problem.
Ele não tá vendo.
Well, are you reading me? Can I start now? Okay, thanks. Well, thank you very much for this invitation. Um, it's a pleasure to participate in this seminar, even online, as I currently have difficulties for mobility due to the recent surgery and iron rent, which prevents me from being with you in person at PUC. Sorry, and it will be a pleasure to meet you personally, but it's impossible. And I appreciate the thanks Kay's invitation, which greatly honors me. And thank you for the excellent presentations given by the panelists who preceded me that facilitate my actions here. Let me share with you a brief presentation to better contribute with the discussion this morning, as I am so far from the room where is running the discussion. So I think it's better to share a presentation. And let me know now if the presentation is clear for you. Okay? Uh, the first question in a seminar like this one, in my opinion, is to identify as precisely we can what exactly we are talking about. In the case of this panel, it's a matter of specifying what we understand by global south and by global governance transformation, part of the title, with regard to global health and what the global south would have to do with this topic. And there would still be the need to speculate on what we understand by state cooperation for a world transition. I think we have some problems like this one. We recognize in our research that Global South as a group of very diverse countries dispersed across all regions and continents of the world, which, due to convergent political, economic, social, environmental, and even health interests, come together more formally or informally in more institutionalized organizations or less formal arrangements of plurilateral nature. And given this spread and the precision, we can speculate that the global south we are talking about is represented at least by the following organizations or political arrangements: BRICS, G77 group plus China, non-aligned movement, the African Union and its sub-regional organizations, Asian, and I put here the UNCTAD, the United Nations Organization for Commerce and Development. And in Latin America, I insert CELAC and some sub-regional organizations, such as the Andean Community, CARICOM, the Central American System, SICA, as we used to call the system, and Mercosur, and some symbols: BRICS, Asian, G77, African Union, and in the case of African Union, the sub-regional areas in the African continent, because African Union and the CDC Africa are precisely Global South. and the East African Community, the Southern African Development Community, SADC, the Arab Maghreb Union, the Community of Sahel-Saharan States, the Economic Community of Central African States, the ECOWAS, Economic Community of Western African States, are all sub-regional organizations within the African Union and within the influence of CDC Africa, that is the most important institution of health. And here in Latin America, we could understand the Global South as the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, the Mercosur, the Andean Community, the Central American System, the CARICOM, the Caribbean Community, even the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, ALBA, and the very, very interesting project called UNASUR that was destroyed by 4 presidents, Macri, Bolsonaro, Duque, and Pinheira, when in 2019, we were in Buenos Aires in the 40 years of PABA, the Buenos Aires plan of action for South cooperation, and they met in Santiago and they destroyed UNASUR. I don't know if you remember this one. Okay, continuing my raciocínio. The main political space for these organizations that constitute, in my opinion, this Global South, this tentative of characterizing Global South, and arrangements, institutions, organizations, and arrangements, the main political space for decision are the leaders' summits, which meet regularly, generally, annually. And the declaration issued from each summit is, in general, the document that convenes the main political positions of this group, almost all of which systematically express themselves on the transformation of global governance with criticisms and proposals for transformations of the governance scheme that express their relative interests. In general, the criticisms and proposals are directed at the United Nations and its main agents, funds, and programs, never for themselves. This is interesting. But with a target generally centered on the Security Council, the World Trade Organization, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and, for sure, the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And therefore, to understand what leaders in the Global South think about the transformations in global governance, in my opinion, the pronouncements of heads of states and government at the United Nations General Assemblies and many of its bodies, as well the declarations and the statements in multilateral groups of countries, appear to be essential sources of information. So we have been studying the positions of these groups regarding global governance and governance of global health, both because are complementary and many criticisms directed to global governance is related to global, to governance of global health also. So I think it's quite important to understand the skill, the studies we have been developing to understand the position of the global south. And let me here is what I have heard up to now, the political spaces relevant to decisions and how, I mean, the Leaders Summit and Foreign Ministers Summit both generate position regarding global health governance and referring to the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, the ECOSOC, where the decision to health-related ones, and the UN Human Rights Council, because we forget that the UN Human Rights Council, it's a very important body of United Nations. Okay, so we have a lot of problems considering, I will pass fast the many questions that constitute problems of global health, including the lethal wars around the globe. So we have many questions in terms of inequalities and the inequities, population, mortality, maternal and perinatal morbidity and mortality, non-communicable diseases, diseases caused by environmental conditions. And we frequently, we used to talk just about infectious and parasitic disease, and not of the all questions of health that are the questions of global health that needs negotiation through the health diplomacy. And on the other side, we have to identify and address the key challenge to global governance and governance of global health that are the political, socio-economic, and environmental determinants of health and its sanitary consequences that are we have clearly this vision when we see the Agenda 2030 and its SDGs, and including the Pact of Future approved last year during the General Assembly. And I don't know, I don't have time to talk about this one, the positions of the main groups, but I will send my presentation for all. The positions of G77, that are many, the positions of UNCTAD, that are many, the positions of Asian, that are many, the positions of African Union, that are many, the positions of the non-aligned movement, that are many, and finally, the positions of the South Center, a very important think tank that used to reflect on global governance and governance of global health. So this material, it's available for you. And I will resume now and finalize my presentation. Remind that the governance of global health is in hands of the WHO system with a lot of very important questions that have been discussing. And finally, let me comment that uh, uh, although it does not constitute a unitary movement, neither institutionally nor in terms of the set of proposals for transformation of global governance, nor of global health governance, several convergences can be identified in the countries and blocs of the Global South. First, the Global South defends multilateralism as an indispensable global public good. Second, not the current multilateralism, but a multilateralism that listens to and includes the emerging forces of the global health. And you can say that many of the political convergences of the United Charter of the United Nations have been lost in these 8 years of history. But we need to restart the discussions of the global governance and the global health governance as a need and a civilizatory compromise. And one of the most bizarre acts in the first week of the new Trump administration was the country's withdrawal from the WHO for admittedly frivolous reasons linked to unproven accusations that the agency's administration supported false Chinese narratives regarding the emergence of COVID-19, that it was withholding information or that it had accidentally or intentionally allowed the spread of the virus. So let me conclude that there were incalculable losses to the very well-planned and consensual WHO Fourth General Work Plan, valid between 2025 and 2028, after the withdrawal of the United States from WHO, and also from the Pan American Health Organization. And finally, when the United States withdraw the Paris Agreement, the United Nations Human Rights Council, the UNESCO, and to outright deny or any support for development and the 2030 Agenda and its SDGs, strikes at the heart of the actions on the main political, social, economic, environmental, and health determinants of human and planetary health. So we have to put all global south with the institutions I have listed, based on the history presented so far about these institutions, and where Brazil has a very important compromise and have to be many things, including things that are discussing now in G20, COP30, like the Belém Health Action Plan for the adaptation of the health sector to climate change, because this is vital for health. And the second, this proposal of Tropical Forests Forever Fund that are imprescindible to get climate change and to have human and planetary health protected, because the forests used to retain carbon, guarantee water flows, and protected biodiversity. So, finally, let me remember you about the elections for the United Nations and the WHO that are scheduled for next year, 2026, with mandates beginning in 2027. Elections that may renew hopes for redesigns of multilateral structures and policies, in which the commitment of countries and blocs of the Global South acquire greater prominence and better respond to the expectation of the world's population. So I think we have many, many reasons to be pessimist, but also many, many reasons to be optimists. And this is my conclusion of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Questions about how to think about the effectiveness and usefulness of the multilateral system more generally, and especially in the context of the global south and also current geopolitics. So you've heard throughout the presentations emphasis on different actors and different challenges that come with them. I think starting from the first presentation about international organization as the format itself and how it is funded. Then, of course, we had Bill Gates having the second coming during the conference. The question of G20 and BRICS and what kind of new agendas they can bring. The question of civil society participation, especially in pandemic treaty negotiation process and some of the democracy challenges that we are seeing. Then the question of private actors, corporations, and the commercial dimension of social determinants of health. So with the richness of this discussion, I'm sure there will be many questions. Please, I would like to open the floor for questions. Yes, Clara.
Hi, my name is Clara Weiner from Maastricht University. Thanks a lot for the interesting panel. I have two questions. The first is a quick one for Pedro. I found it very interesting what you said about the closing space for civil society actors and global health governance. And I was wondering if you know who are the actors behind the excluding of civil society actors in the pandemic treaty. And then I picked up upon you saying that there were also right-wing civil society actors demonstrating against it. So I was wondering if they are also trying to get in and whether this could be related. And then maybe for the other panelists, we talked a lot in Deborah's presentation yesterday about differential treatment of countries with different levels of development and so on and so forth. So I was wondering if in the discussion at G20 or in the pandemic treaty, you see this is also a feature in the substance of the global health recommendations that you find. I mean, I think, Mirko, you mentioned something in the access to petroleum sharing that out of this 20%, 10% would be donated, right? So this sounds a bit like CBDR or differential treatment of developing countries. And there you mentioned some language on equity. So I would be interested to hear, what's being debated.
Deborah Farias from University of New South Wales. My question has to do with what has been, from your reading, the concrete implications of the US leaving the World Health Organization. Have there been, is it still the same thing minus the US? You know, how much has it been in terms of a real difference, a real impact or not?
Do we have any more questions? All right, let's start with these two. Please. Whoever wants to reply.
Organizations, it's not an official information, so please don't quote it. And but what we've heard is that, I mean, many countries from the north, global north, plus China. So it was an interesting alignment between US and China, although the US was not in the room again. But they articulated to to have it behind closed doors. We know some countries they pushed against it. Brazil, Argentina at the time was not governed by Milei. Chile, Colombia, don't know if I'm missing any countries, but I mean mostly the progressive governments from Latin America. They would try to push against it, but those who are not in favor of excluding non-state actors from the room, they were not as vocal as those in favor of excluding the civil society organization. As per the extreme right activists, so during the WHA, I don't think they were inside the WHA, but in the first phases of the pandemic treaty negotiations, the INB did something that I think they regret a lot, which was a public hearing in which you had to submit a video, you had to upload the video in a platform they created. And it was chaotic because many extreme right organizations, they organized themselves to participate in those online hearings. And I mean, when you look at those videos, it's like all the conspirational theories that you can think of. And I mean, it takes a lot of patience, but someone did that job so that you don't have to watch the videos. There is a paper by researchers from the University of São Paulo, from Vitória Ramos, Leandro Viegas, and Lisa Ventura, and they kind of analyzed the public hearings videos, and they watched hours of footage. And I mean, I imagine that they lost some years of their lives doing that, but I mean, that's what you have to do for the science, right? And so the implications of the US leaving, I mean, I see two very concrete implications. One is funding, of course, and with that other, with the same implication that Gates is now the largest funder of the WHO, which is, I think it's very concerning. And the second one is the fact that it can have on other countries. So other countries can follow, and it sets an example for countries. So it kind of empties the WHO in terms of their legitimacy in itself. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the super interesting question. Maybe also on the Trump thing. So, but it's interesting if you sort of talk to the people who were negotiating the pandemic agreement, is that one of the unintended consequences of this was sort of a rally around the flag effect among negotiators. There seemed to have been a sort of spirit of, now we really need to do something. Like basically this whole global health architecture might fall apart if we don't do it now, and so on. So in a way, the immediate consequences for the pandemic agreement might have actually been positive in two ways, right? One, by catalyzing everybody's sort of attention, but the other by removing a sort of major blocking actor on a range of issues that the US had become from January onwards, obviously, or would have become if they would have stayed. That said, I think the long-term consequences are great, right, in terms of funding, but also in terms of, I mean, something that Pedro already described, right? Like, it's not like the US is disengaging. They're leaving, but they're very much paying attention. You have several actors in the US that are very interested in what's going on in global health and very much interested in undermining any effort of doing things, especially on equity and access, but among a range of different areas. Maybe on the closing space, I think what's interesting is that I think, I mean, I'm speculating here now. But I think it's sort of from research, we know that when civil society gets more, let's say, to the fringes, there is a tendency to try to restrict civil space in international negotiations, because it moves it away from the technocratic type of debates that international bureaucrats and negotiators really like. I also think it's important to say that it's not necessarily just the far right, right? There's sort of long-standing anthroposophic movements in Europe, which are more associated with left-wing politics that are very, very critical. Yeah, exactly. But in Europe, it is sort of it might be more complicated than just one particular actor. But I think in general there was a sense, or my interpretation is that might have played a role. I think what's interesting is because you're moving from sort of participation at the global level to a ratification-based system, there are entry points for civil society at the national level because the ratification needs to be debated in national parliaments, right? So you're giving it to a democratic system at the national level. On the other end, it's not about shaping the agreement, it's about sort of agreeing to it, really, when you go in a ratification negotiation. But I think sort of by giving it to sort of an Article 19 process, you are getting that democratic legitimation from, at least in democratic countries, from national parliaments, which I think also empower people to be more selective in who they want to engage with.
The concrete consequence of US withdrawal from the WHO, but there were questions, so but they answered way better, but I would say for sure it had contributed for this 10.5 billion in financing gap for other instances too that are not necessarily through the WHO, but I would raise another impact that is the denialism, also like the ideologies and ideas that these actors, US government, civil society, and right, civil society actors and private actors also spread throughout the world. So I think the divide is between these social determinants of health campaigns and advocates from the global south, and on the other side, commercial interests of these private actors that are becoming more and more clear and exacerbated. And I'm not sure if I understood the question. It's about if there is a difference of treatment within the G20, more or less.
Developing countries versus developed countries.
Okay. But the G20, I mean, vis-a-vis the G7, yes, for sure. But within the G20, you mean? Okay. I would say like the CBDR applies as well because we have low and middle income countries. So of course they are not the same, but overall they have some flags that are common. And as I saw, reading again and again, all these declarations that they subscribe and they publish. The point is on this vaccine production, of course, the sharing of technology among all of them, together with the neglected and socially determined disease. This appears very much within this country. It doesn't matter if they are more or less prepared. And Brazil's president on both BRICS and G20 emphasizes this a lot. Brazil has long-standing history on defending public health, as we know in our system here. So I think it's more this. Can I have a question to them, or maybe we give the floor? Okay, please. Andrea. I can do that. You take your opportunity too.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I think this analysis is very good that the main sectors driving the health crisis are private and such. Now what we see is, as you pointed out, that they are coming from the global north and we cannot expect for them to self-regulate. So it has to either come from the countries that suffer under them or the countries that they are active in. It is unlikely that the global north is going to regulate them. So my question is, what kind of policies could we see in the global south, and have there been cases in Latin America where they have successfully addressed the problem of these transnational corporations?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, my question will have a direct related issue with your question. And so I had 2 points. One, I started with this, is that the question was to all of you, but also Paulo Bus, who we know that contributed actually to build ISARS at UNASUR and a lot of these initiatives. And I wanted to ask you whether some initiatives actually can have without those organizations. And relating to what you're asking, what examples we have of effective initiatives, and I wanted to bring attention to this Bank of Medicines that I worked also with a colleague at Pio Nascimento, who was very active in this area as well. And we had that in UNASUR, and also Mercosur, actually. So Mercosur still exists. And this is basically sharing information. Countries that willing to can share information of the price they pay for medicine from all those business and companies. So they can share those prices and try to negotiate together. And this has been effective in a couple of medicine in the case of UNASUR and Mercosur. So the question is that possible? Because this is a condition of winning. Whichever country who buys medicine for their public system can perhaps engage in those initiatives and negotiate together. And the other question was related to, I think, what Mirko said. Of course, already yesterday we were mentioning that the relation between the crisis of multilateralism and the crisis of the democratic crisis at the domestic level. And I think it's fair what Mirko said, that we know that the multilateral system has been criticized over at least 2 decades by not only the extreme right, but several actually ideological camps and positions. And it's healthy, of course, if you do have also this contestation and resistance in specific issues. But I think it's true that in a certain point, we had a kind of a more comprehensive criticism of the multilateral system. And that's not only BRICS, with that specific issue of reforming the multilateral, but also in the political spectrum from left to right. And now that we see the right, not only actually destroying it, but occupying it, I think it's a very, and I think Pedro example, there are other examples. We worked with the Geneva Consensus on gender and LGBT+, where suddenly instead of also withdrawing and removing the money from these institutions, they start having a common platform. And that's really worrisome because that puts also a strategic question to also political leftish movements and countries and whatever to what to do with the multilateral system. Either you criticize it or you occupy it. And we know that that has been taking place. And I think it's a different situation now. To remove and to criticize, you're giving space for some very strategic actors. And I didn't know about the pandemic treaty on all these negotiations with the WTO, but we know about other areas. And yeah, so some actors occupying and bringing some other agendas, normative agendas. Also, Milani said that even judicial and activism with the judicial can also be used on the other side. So just put like the complexification of it.
Just answering very quick, Andrea's provocation about the medicine coalition. Yes, it's true. And when we look at the pharmaceutical companies, this makes difference. Of course, sometimes they can negotiate voluntary or compulsory in a sense. But in regard to the unhealth industry, the unhealthy commodity industry, I don't think this has any impact. It's like, that's why I named it this industry, like they really don't care for this coalition. They are provoking the harm and they know it as well as the norms to regulate the externality that they provoked. It is very clear. So for the regional organizations, I think they can pressure, of course, that's what they have to do. And already answering a little bit of Amadeus' question, if we don't have much to do in regard to private actors, for instance, Bill Gates Foundation that we are talking about, imagine in regards to transnational corporations, it's even more difficult to assess because it's not the case that they are just voluntary, it's the case that they are denying, they don't want to take part in this kind of what Paulo said, civilizatory compromise to bring planetary health and One Health. So I just want to continue the question, asking exactly this to Pedro and to Mirko. What's the difference that you saw in your, like in Pedro, in terms of the negotiation, and Mirko in terms of the IND and democratic status of the WTO? The difference between these philanthrocapitalist actors and the transnational corporations, because we know, like, to talk about private actors is not the same to talk about this unhealthy commodities industry. If you saw the differences and if you saw like resistance among the different camps.
Go first.
Thank you, Miko. Very interesting questions, and I remember when I used to ask questions. And what's your name again? Oh, I did. Thank you. Oh, great. Very interesting question. So, how to regulate transnational corporations? I think this is the no, not even 1 million, right? Perhaps 1 billion question, $1 billion question. And I like to remember a process that took place in the Human Rights Council of the UN. Paulo Cruz mentioned it. Not the process, but the Human Rights Council, which was an attempt to have a binding treaty on transnational corporations and human rights, which was a process to try to fill the gaps in terms of regulating activities of transnational corporations, violating human rights, because, I mean, if you take the case of, I think it's Exxon, that there was a huge leak in Ecuador, right? And they tried to sue it in Ecuador, but the headquarters was in Canada. And then they tried to sue it in Canada, but the leak took place in Ecuador. So where do you claim the rights of the affected population, right? And this is a huge issue. In talking about specifically of pharmaceutical transnational corporations, many countries try to include what they call the peace clause in the pandemic treaty text, which was a statement saying that countries where those corporations were based would refrain from pressuring countries that would try to issue compulsory measures such as the compulsory license to tackle patents and other intellectual property rights that would difficult access to health products, right? But that text didn't happen. We had a TRIPS waiver in the World Trade Organization, but I worked very hard on this process, trying to shift country positions. There was a huge support by almost every country from the global south, but the EU and the US, they blocked the World Trade Organization. And what we said by then was, if not now, then when? Apparently never, right? Apparently never going to put lives before profits again in this world. I chose not to believe that, but anyway. And talking about the gates and international corporations, Andrea, it came to my mind the Unitate. You know Unitate? That joint venture or this arm of the World Health Organization that funds health initiatives to promote access to health products, to HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, so on and so forth. And Gates is in the board of Unitate, right, along with several other countries. And I worked in a project funded by Unitate to remove intellectual property barriers I don't know, it was a consortium of 17 countries, of 6 organizations, to work on intellectual property and remove intellectual property barriers in 17 countries. I was working in Brazil, and we coordinated the Latin American hub. And you can imagine how difficult it was to get Gates from being just be quiet. Don't say anything against it, because they were against it, the project. You know, that we convinced the Unitate Secretariat, we convinced, I don't know, the Brits to know, to not be against it. But the most difficult one was Gates. That's, I think it gives a clue of how things move in the, I don't know, the underground of the global health governance, right? And the critique on multilateral system you were saying, I remember that, I don't know, back in 2015, we used to shout down, down WTO, the WTO, right? Because we didn't want the World Trade Organization pushing for, how do you say that? I can't find the words. But yeah, the pressuring countries to implement certain measures, so on and so forth. And yeah, the conditionality. And now it brings a reflection now that I always think about that, and I invite colleagues to think about that, which is apparently you cannot vote anything anymore in the global governance system. Apparently, you only can adopt things by consensus, which for me is unthinkable, because the multilateral governance system was designed to have a vote, especially on the World Health Organization, because each country has one vote. And that was designed to, for me, thinking here, to have global South countries to gather efforts and achieve things that they cannot achieve individually, right? So they can articulate themselves, and that's why how things happened in the 70s and in the 80s, and more or less in the 90s in the World Health Organization. But apparently you cannot vote anymore on the World Health Organization.
So maybe in that, if
Okay, I'll wrap up.
I also am mindful that we're basically already in the break. So maybe just two quick things. But I think the first is, I think it's very important that goes to Karina's question and also to Amadeus' question. Like, it's very important to be mindful of the ways in which private sector actors engage with global governance. But it's also very important, and I think Carolina did that very nicely, is to sort of think very carefully about the different types of private actors and what their respective intentions are. So you can't lump them all into one bucket. I think Carolina talked very much about it, very sort of persuasively about the importance of sort of polluting industry and tobacco and so on. And they have a very different set of interests and a very different role in global health than pharmaceutical companies have, right? Who provide something we all want, but maybe in a way that is not in the way that many people want, which is a very different thing than providing something that undermines health, right? And then the third thing is philanthropic foundations who have particular interests, but these interests tend to not be commercial. Like Gates doesn't have a commercial interest in protecting intellectual property. He has a way of thinking about how innovation happens and how he assesses risk to global health long-term versus short-term benefits. I think there's a lot of debate and many more panels to be had to discuss the merits of that argument. But it's very important to very carefully take these different things apart because they all matter, but in very different ways. And it's very, very important to differentiate that. Thank you. I'll leave it at that, but I might find you in the break. So
thank you so much to the wonderful panelists and great discussion. Sorry.
But Eva can end the panel, right? You can close the
panel. Sorry. The panel is concluded.
Before we all run
Tem mais ou menos uns 10 anos. Depois eu não faço tudo. É só água. Pedrada. A boquinha já tá aqui, ó. Sabe quando você vai chegando... Eu vou tomar aqui, ó. Sabe quando você vai chegando perto do cachorro que ele já tá fazendo... Não tem referência. Por quê? A de 88, sim. Igualzinho.
Thank you for coming, everybody, and welcome to our second panel of the day. This one on not climate and environment, that's what we're living here, but really human rights and migration. I'm very pleased to have with me here three excellent experts on the topic from both sides of the Atlantic. So first, our first by order will be Felix Bergman, who is a PhD candidate and lecturer at Maastricht University in the Faculty of Law. Felix's research focuses on international refugee law and European migration and asylum law, with particular attention to the phenomenon of instrumentalized migration Part of his current duties dealing both with research work on international EU law, is a member of the management team of the Maastricht Center for European Law and the Faculty of Law, Belmont Chair in Migration Law. He serves on the editorial team for case law of the International Journal of European Law. Florian Hoffman from the Law Department here at PUC, holds a bachelor's degree in law and political science from LSE, a master's degree in legal science from PUC, and a PhD in law from the EUI. He's taught at LSE, at PUC, at the Willy School of Public Policy at the University of Erfurt. Florian has experience in the field of law, political science, and public policy with an emphasis on public international law. His main areas of research and teaching include human rights, philosophy of law, public international law, constitutional law, and social rights. Last but not least, Carolina Mula-Aguiar is with us today. She holds a bachelor's degree in law from the Federal University of Minas Gerais, a BA also in IR from PUC Minas. She earned a master's degree in international relations from PUC and a PhD in IR from McMaster University in Canada. She's an associate professor at Cedric Fassi at the Federal University of Minas. Her research focuses primarily on issues of borders and international mobility, displacement, migration, and refugees, their relationship to the reconfiguration of citizenship, humanitarian infrastructure and logistics, and critical theories of international relations. She coordinated the Cedric de Mello Chair at PUC-Rio together with UNHCR between 2016 and 2019, and served as the coordinator of our graduate program here as well after that time. So I'm super happy to have you with us. Let's start in the order of the program with Felix, then you each, because the three of you have 15 to 20 minutes. There we go.
Hello. Yeah.
So nice.
Let's see. Yes. Can my slides be put on the screen, please? Yes, thanks very much. Right, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, Kai, for the organization and the kind invitation. What I will be doing is setting the scene for the board discussion. I'll be presenting each of the deliverable on migration and human rights. We intend to transform global migration governance through and beyond the global compacts. And this was co-authored by our very moderator here, as well as my PhD supervisor in Maastricht, Sorby. The report is available online on the Incho website, so if you're interested, have a look. What I will be doing with all of you today is taking you through it. Basically, I'll give you a bit of a background in what is the contemporary state of the global migration governance framework, so just as a bit of an introduction. And we will then go over the 5 challenges that we identify in the report to this system. We'll move on to discussing some of its key achievements, so the global compact specifically has some positives, but also have a few negatives, as I will get to in a minute. And then we'll briefly reflect on the central research question of our report, which was what are the robustness, effectiveness, and democratic credentials to the UN global compacts, and to what extent have these resulted in enhanced access to protection, as well as labor mobility opportunities, which, as you will see in a minute, are 2 of the central challenges to the framework. And then finally, I'll have some brief thoughts on what the future might hold for this particular field. But I'll start with a bit of background. So what is the global migration governance framework? There is a definition you see on the slide here from by the IOM. But what is particularly interesting for us and for me here today is that you see here it talks of the combined framework of legal norms, laws, regulations, policy traditions, etc. Everything is the core. What does this indicate to you is that there is not one single legally binding document dealing with the area of migration. So in international law, some areas are regulated in great detail and some areas are not regulated at all or purely at international law. And so what this means is, what does this framework look like today? I think it's already a relatively old quote you see here on the slide from 1984, but I still think it captures the essence. Really, what does this framework really look like? It's a giant, unassembled, theoretical jigsaw puzzle for which the number of pieces is uncertain and the grand design is still emerging. So we don't know how many pieces we have, nor do we know what we are building towards. What is the end goal, let's say. Yet, despite all of that, in 2018, the United Nations decided to add two non-binding pieces to the puzzle. What are they? These are the two compacts that we focus on in the report, namely the Global Compact on Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, the GCM, or the Migration Compact, as I already referred to, and the UN Global Compact on Refugees, the GCR and the Refugee Compact. And these were very much meant to enhance international cooperation and discussion on global migration management, with potentially maybe the hope that they could in the future result also in their new binding. So now you have a basic idea of what this global migration governance framework consists of. What are the main challenges facing it that we have identified? There are 5, as you can see on the slide here. The first 2 are much more entrenched challenges. So these are challenges that the framework has been dealing with pretty much from its inception. The first one is the limited labor mobility opportunities. So in international law, there are some binding standards when it comes to legal labor migration. There are 2 treaties by the International Labour Organization, where we already, and there's of course the ICRMW, a human rights treaty for migrant workers. And these things face significant challenges, though. What are these challenges? First of all, they do not entail a right of entry for migrants. So the states are still in charge in deciding how many people do I let in every year. That's the same at regional level, and the European Union works exactly the same way. And that challenge is sort of exacerbated even more by the fact that they suffer from very low ratification rates. So particularly in the global north, almost no country has actually signed up to these conventions. Then compared to that, so while the labor mobility route, let's say, is still very limited, right? The amount of regulation that we have on this topic is almost nothing. The most developed, on the other hand, is of course the protection of refugees, where we have the 1951 Convention, the 67 Protocol, a very elaborate system already. And broadly speaking, in the literature, this framework is credited with doing 2 things very well. Namely, it gives us a definition of who qualifies as a refugee. The world agrees on that. We may have problems with that definition. I'll leave that to you, but at least we have a basic understanding of who is a refugee. And secondly, it has a long list of incremental rights, right? So essentially, the longer you stay in a state of reception, the more obligations that state has towards you, is how this framework works. So while both these things are positive developments, you could say the Refugee Convention also has significant lacunas. Namely, it does not say anything on global responsibility sharing, which is why the great majority of refugees are in countries closer to most of the world armed conflicts and relatively poor as well. And so that's a big problem. And the second problem, the Refugee Convention actually says nothing on procedures. So the way refugees are supposed to be treated in states, there is nothing whatsoever, right? So countries can do this themselves. And one of the central problems that this has resulted in is that many countries, again, particularly global north countries, implement so-called non-entrée policies or externalization policies. There are many words for this, but essentially what that means is I will simply prevent people from ever getting to my territory, right? So all my obligations, once you make it to the definition of a refugee, Article 1, then everything kicks in. But if I simply prevent you from ever getting to my territory, then I have no obligations. So it's something we very much, for example, the European Union, but so these are the entrenched challenges. Now, then there was a little bit of a hope in 2018. There are these 2 new documents, the GCR and GCM. Can these help overcome these challenges? Which was kind of the research question that we looked into for our report as well. And I will leave the conclusions a little bit further, but to already tell you, these compacts themselves also have a number of challenges. Namely, first of all, they are non-binding. That, of course, in and of itself has also significant challenges to the effectiveness, right? You cannot actually hold anybody accountable for a long list of objectives. Essentially what these compacts are. If you have a look at them, it's a long list of goals to be achieved. There are some sections as well on follow-up and review and these kind of things, but it's the core of it are all objectives. Well, if they're non-binding, that causes significant limitations, even though in and of themselves they are quite interesting. Particularly the GCM is very ambitious. It does things that the binding framework does not do. I put one example on the slide here. It's GCM objective number 5, which explicitly responds to the first challenge. It actually says we will work towards creating more labor mobility opportunities. But of course, if this objective is just an objective and non-binding, does it actually solve all that much? And it's difficult, let's say. So that's a challenge for the compacts themselves. A related challenge, which you could of course say, well, the fact that these things are non-binding is perhaps not so problematic if there then is at least a proper functioning accountability mechanism, if there is some sort of follow-up on what you promise under these compacts and the institutional developments that come with them, which I'll touch on in a minute. But that is also a big problem. Essentially, accountability follow-up under these frameworks doesn't really exist. So there are institutional developments. Each compact has its own multi-annual forum. You have the Global Refugee Forum for the GCR, and you have the International Migration Review Forum for the GCM. This is a place where all stakeholders meet, so not just states. It's supposed to be everybody. But do these forums function as a real accountability forum? No, not at all. And the way it was described to me also by interviewees is essentially it's a place where you can come and you can advertise what you have done, and great if all of that links up with the GCM and the GCR objectives, but nobody will ask you what you have not done. So the things that you promised last time, did you actually achieve them? No, nobody will ask that. And so that's yeah, so there is a serious accountability gap in the compacts. And then the final challenge, but that's I think the thing that we've been hearing throughout the last 2 days is the decline in funding. Of course, all I'll say about those is that the Trump 2 funding cuts are perhaps the most severe, but these are not unusual. They come on the back of years and years and years of parliaments also very much rolling back their funding for this framework. So these are the 5 challenges that we've identified. Now, all that is not to say that compacts are pointless. And they do a couple of things, and they do a couple of things quite well. We have listed them here. There are 3 main achievements. First of all, they reaffirm existing commitments, which in the contemporary climate on this sort of the political climate is already quite an achievement. Getting the world, of course, not all of the world, right? There are a few countries that didn't sign up to this, but the great majority of states did. Getting them to all reaffirm the existing binding arrangements and all of this stuff is already quite something. Then there are innovative elements in them. The second point, as I already touched upon, right, particularly the GCM is credited with having potentially huge potential. They do push the GCM pushes the boundaries of what we already have. For example, the thing on labor mobility I already mentioned, but there's also, for example, objectives on the links between climate change and environmental degradation with migration, etc., which in the binding framework does not exist, but in the GCM is very much explicitly there. The GCR overall is much less ambitious. So the central challenge, as I mentioned there, was the lack of accountability, the lack of responsibility sharing, right? There is no global responsibility sharing mechanism, and we have this problem of a lack of access to international protection. On that, there are some comments, but it's really not very far-reaching. It's all very ambitious, aspirational language, but nothing really, nothing substantive. And then finally, as I said, there are these institutional innovations, the 2 forums that are organized every 4 years, and in between there are regular stock-taking events, both at the global level as well as the regional level, which again, overall, the people we spoke to for the report are very positive about these events. At least there is now one central place under the umbrella of the UN where we can meet and discuss these things, but I've also already said, right, it's not a formal accountability mechanism, so it's mainly advertising what you have as said. A second crucial function of these forums is this is also the central place where pledges are made and can be made throughout the whole process, but this is the central place where they are announced, let's say, formally speaking. And quite a number of pledges have been announced at all these previous forums, let's say, but there is also a major problem here. Maybe we have a lot of pledges, but pledges in themselves only get us so far. What about the implementation? Well, as you can see here on the slide, that is seriously lacking behind. So these are data provided by the UN itself. The GCR data is provided by the UNHCR, and the GCM is by the UN Network on Migration. As you can see here, only 17 of the registered 309 GCM pledges, so roughly 6% have been completed, and roughly 600 out of 3,430 GCR pledges have been completed. And of course, now there are the funding cuts which raise even further concerns, right? For example, in 2022, at one of the last rounds, a lot of pledges were made. Are these still feasible? We don't know. Quite a lot of the organizations who may have pledged at the time might not even be in existence anymore. So the funding cuts are, of course, also potentially undermining this. So there may have to be a bit of a reassessment or recalculation for pledges we even have. Right? Do these even exist, and are they still? Right, so yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag. If we then move to sort of the result of our study on the 3 concepts of the internal project, robustness, effectiveness, and democracy, it's not a brilliant picture, as I think you can sort of gather from what I've been saying before. When it comes to the robustness of the framework, yeah, there are of course significant concerns about the funding cuts. UNHCR and the IOM have already had to fire quite a lot of their staff. Personally speaking as well, quite a few of the interviews that I had originally set up were cancelled last minute because people were simply fired. So there is a big yeah, there are big changes going on. When it comes to the rules of aid, right? As I said, we have existing binding frameworks, but these come with entrenched challenges, and the compacts have their own challenges, mainly related again to their non-binding nature and the lack of ability. And when we look at effectiveness, that's also quite limited. So when we look at, right, have these things actually resulted in any subsequent treaties or any subsequent non-binding arrangements, it's really not a lot. At best, the impact, the actual effect of all of this stuff is indirect. So sometimes in, for example, international agreements made between the EU and third countries, there are indirect references to it. For example, they talk of safe, orderly, and regular migration. They never explicitly refer to the compacts. The EU can't because a number of EU member states didn't sign up, so that's a problem. Yeah, particularly the outcome, the impact level, I said, it's largely non-existent. At best, there are some indirect impacts, but it's not a lot. Then finally, when it comes to the level of democracy, overall participation, it's generally regarded as quite positive. There is the whole government approach that everybody is allowed to, sort of whole society approach, so everybody is allowed to participate. Although more recently, there is also a bit of a rolling back of access for civil society organizations. And that's particularly on the kind of I've mentioned, right? That's pretty much non-existent. So that is a significant problem in the framework. And then finally, I get to the future. So where is all of this heading? What are we sort of saying might be happening? And we have simply identified a number of scenarios. I do need the crystal ball, so I don't know for sure. But this is kind of what we have come up with. Of course, one option, which is, I'll be honest, may have to be able to find this kind, but it's very likely. No, not at all. None of the people we spoke to from any of the major actors are in support of this option, this first option. But it is an option, you could say. And it was part of the original rationale of the compact as well. There was an idea that maybe these ambitious things, particularly in the DCM, could maybe eventually lead to a finally one binding treaty migration. And there is very interesting, I think, literature on all of this, on all of the stuff of what could that then consist of, how would that be different from the current framework. If you're interested, I can recommend the book readings on all of this stuff. But yeah, there are interesting ideas, but as I say, it's at the moment completely politically unlikely. And also there is a risk on the civil society part. Let's say there's also a worry about Pandora's box, right? If you now reopen the negotiations on the refugee convention, it's likely, given the contemporary political climate, going to be less protective rather than more protective, right? So would that lead to solving this problem of no effective access to protection? Very, very unlikely. Okay. The second scenario we have identified is then, okay, you could, of course, try to have targeted improvements of the contemporary framework. Is there a lot possible? Not very much, I would say. There are a couple of things you could try and do. For example, one of the things we have identified is you could have a modalities resolution, like every time the Global Refugee Forum and the International Migration Review Forum happen, there is a modalities resolution. You could, of course, in that resolution, along with the Secretariat, for and more stringent accountability mechanism, for example. Now, may not fly, but at least you could try. So this is something you could try and do, but again, currently find it very politically unlikely. So then options 3 and 4 on the board are much more the likely scenarios and the things we actually see happening in the world. There is, of course, the option to simply reform the current UN framework, and this seems to be what's happening. You probably have all seen the leaked memo, right, from the UN-80 task force, where the idea is we are going to merge all of the UN's humanitarian agencies, so we will not have UNHCR and UNICEF and the IOM and this, and we'll have one single humanitarian agency, whatever. See, this is part of the idea, which would, from a migration perspective, have two likely consequences. Of course, migration priorities will be integrated into other policies, and this we will see in option 4 as well. We are leveraging everything, right? We say to the country, you have to cooperate in readmission, and in return, you get trade benefits and security benefits and investment benefits and this and this. So that's one thing that would likely happen, and was an overall decline in global attention for migration-specific challenges. Then finally, and that also runs up my presentation, is what else is a likely scenario, and this is something very much we see happening, is if it doesn't work at the global level, we will simply do it ourselves. Yeah, so option 4 is what we see really happening around the world, which is there are some examples of mini-lateralism, right? So looking for coalitions of the willing, but even that is not really what the major actors are doing. The major actors are simply going for bilaterals. We are directly negotiating with a third country, yeah, we are trying to strike a deal. So we have seen examples of this with Trump 1 administration. We have the Remain in Mexico policy that was quite well known, right? Which is also essentially, we give you $10 billion and then you stop people from crossing the border, at least until their hearing has been set, right? So you readmit people who are already in the US, and until the court hearing has been set, then we will take them back. So that's an example of that. Australia has a very famous example, or maybe infamous example, I should say. They of course have their offshore processing, so intercepting people in international waters and then putting them on Pacific Islands in detention centers, which are run by private actors. And the estimated costs are, I think, around 4,200 detainees. The Australian Senate estimated 12 billion Australian dollars. So it's expensive doing all of this stuff. And finally, that's what the European Union is doing exactly. It's looking increasingly for third countries, both in Eastern Europe as well as in Africa, making direct visits, right? And these follow this sort of whole of government approach, which is this idea of we are putting everything on the table. You're not just cooperating on migration, you get all kinds of benefits in all kinds of other fields, and in return, we demand that we prevent illegal immigration, and we demand that you accept readmissions, not just of your own nationals, but for anybody who has traveled through your territory on the way to the European Union. So this is very much what both the previous commission and the current commission are doing. Yeah, that's it from my side. There are a few references, but I'll leave those for what they are. And that's it from my side. Thank you very much.
Also for taking the time. Go ahead.
This work, yeah. So while my PowerPoint is being put on, it's being formal. So I want to thank really my dear colleague Kai and all the others from PUC-Rio who have been organizing this really interesting event, and commend the topics I think which have been discussed, which are very, very super interesting. Now, according to the instructions we've received from our I will essentially tell you exactly what you just heard in other words, but there is, of course, a necessary degree of overlap, probably here as well. I also wanted to precede this very briefly by some contextualization. I'm an international lawyer, as we said earlier. I am involved here together with originally Carolina when she was still here at PUC, at an initiative by UNHCR's country office Brazil, the so-called in English de Mello chairs, named after David de Mello, who used to be a high-level UN diplomat, Brazilian born, of course, who ended up dying in the Baghdad bomb attack against the UN headquarters there, and UNHCR in Brazil created this network of university chairs in refugee studies, essentially, very broadly put. So we come to this theme from very different disciplinary perspectives, starting with IR, of course, and international law, but also rather differently. And I think now Carol is running another one in Minas at Golden Gate. So I'm sure you'll talk about this, but this was where we all came to this. So in terms of, I got this. So in terms of, right, so obviously, I'll oscillate a little bit between zooming out from Felix's point of attack and partly zooming in. Yeah? So this will be sort of surrounding your presentation a little bit. So obviously, migration remains one of the supposedly 10 or biggest issues of 2005 and 2025. I'm sorry, and obviously there's no big surprise. I mean, the news are essentially entirely crowded and full with news on migration, both in terms of migration governance, as we've heard, crackdown in the US, Europe trying to also crack down without seeming to see. Being seen as cracking down in the same way as the US. In that sense, probably ICE is doing the Europeans and Frontex a favor, because it's quite easy to distinguish yourself positively from what ICE is doing. But then also, of course, the big problem with European, American, other democracies in relation to the migration issue, which has become and jumped to the first line issue, completely contrary, it should be said, to some of the real life challenges some of these countries facing. So it's amazing how the migration issue jumps to sort of the first 2-3 issues in election campaigns, regardless of what the actual situation of the country or the actual situation in the region actually is. So this is a super complicated topic. Obviously, I won't sort of run you through the maps. We've got, in terms of migration governance, of course, the migration routes. Oops, this is actually a migration route from 70,000 years ago. Let me put the right one. Oh, sorry, yeah. Let me put the right one. Yeah, so this is the actual migration routes. And of course, the respective numbers related to them. And as I said, we've got a rather shocking descent of political discourse when it comes especially to both human rights and migration, because remember, this panel is essentially about the nexus between human rights and migration. I will be talking a little bit about that nexus in complement to Felix's presentation. So as I said, we've seen challenges. So migration itself is increasingly being challenged. It's increasingly being regulated, cracked down on, etc. But similarly, of course, human rights, as we've known them, at least the regional human rights frameworks, the national human rights system, is being challenged. There's been long-standing talk by the United Kingdom, but then increasingly also some other countries to leave the European Convention of Human Rights. That talk has been mimicked in the Americas to some extent during certain types of government, in a sense, and so both are in between, in a sense, a rock and a hard place. So let's have a look at the law then. As I'm like Felix, approach this from a legal perspective, which, however, I think communicates to some extent with what you all are approaching this from. So let's have a look at what the refugee regime, we've heard about this, so I'm just going to complement what Felix has been saying, just to kind of contextualize it. So we're still operating here with a post-war framework. So the refugee prevention, which has a number of protocols, etc., that we said, now has some compacts, but the fundamental logic of the refugee regime and of treating asylum, refugee, sort of legal migration, especially post-displacement in terms of migration, remains this post-war regime, yeah, and it has, many people kind of often slot it in with the international human rights regime, sort of just one more treaty, etc. But of course, it is in nature somewhat different, yeah. So it has, for example, a clear what we call exilic bias. So it's not really focused on the state of origin, and human rights tend to be focused on the conditions of people in particular states, which would be here the states of origin. It's limited geographically and temporally. It has, of course, extensive security exceptions and a rather unique, very targeted, and therefore very limited human rights structure vis-a-vis refugees. And of course, human rights treaties also usually have public order exceptions, but the security exceptions for the refugee regime, the refugee convention, have from the very beginning been much more extensive. So there's always been kind of a ring fencing of who exactly may count or may not count as a forcibly displaced person who has a right to asylum or not. It's also silent on procedural issues. Felix echoed that. So there's always sort of the baseline decisions, the baseline regime, but then exactly on how it's being implemented is left open. And we can see this most recently, perhaps, with the beginning implementation of the EU Pact on Migration, of course, which looks not necessarily good, but looks at least at something on paper. But of course, there are very grave doubts in terms of exactly how some of its aspects are actually being implemented on the ground. And I mean, we're getting news in the sense that that implementation on the ground doesn't really comply that very well with the human rights provision, which is legally, in fact, a big problem, I think, and will be a big problem for the EU. So, so basically, Felix already mentioned, I mean, there's any number of instruments, international instruments on migration beyond the convention and, on top of the convention in a sense. Some of them are soft law, but most of them are actually nominally hard law. But then if we look at the status of ratification, you can see that, yes, there is then sort of the shadow of the 90s, where we have sort of a certain upsurge of a number of instruments, but especially, I mean, the one that goes up furthest, the human trafficking protocol, of course, already has very much to do with the containment of certain types of migration in a sense. You know, I'm not going to go into the details of this, but we can also see a certain north-south divide here, and you can certainly see a declining curve in terms of the more specific instruments, especially when it comes to migrant workers, etc. Most of the North continuing to very much insist on that very fundamental distinction between a rather limited interpretation of forced displacement and then all the rest, which of course now, I mean, traditionally would be framed often by the political right as economic migration, yeah, or economically motivated migration, but which today factually is often entangled with what we would call environmental cause migration, yeah, which of course is the next big, probably biggest thing in the migration studies and the migration scenarios. So Felix already talked a little bit about some of the structure. I won't obviously replicate what you said about the compacts, just to reinforce in a sense the fact that I think one has to always read these initiatives from two sides. And one has to read them as part of a sort of broadly multilateral process and conjunction. And I suppose they come towards the end of the current period of multilateralism, yeah, and are probably have been squeezed in, you know, because they've been on the agenda for a very long time. States probably by a majority did feel they kind of did have to do something about it. But you can already see that, you know, if by even there's different degrees of softness in law, and this is really sort of the softest of soft in a sense, you know. And that's the other dimension of it, which is sort of the on-the-ground dimension. And I remember also Kai interviewed some of us, of course, on this. And it is, and the question was always, so what do they actually do? You know, what's going to change with the compact? And of course, a lawyer, given the particular way in which these compacts were passed and their content, yes, they are in a sense almost designed to not change that very much, but to accommodate most of the existing regimes, to not necessarily worsen them. So this is not Trumpism. This is not negating what everyone has been doing. It's more like affirming what everyone's been doing without changing anything, which arguably maybe is the predicament of late multilateralism. In that yesterday's world that we all come from still. Of course, you can see that also with the vote structure of both compacts on refugee and migration. You know, the US, of course, prominently out, Poland prominently out, but a number of abstentions, including Australia, indeed. But of course, the rest of the world happily going in a sense, which on the ground really hasn't made a huge difference. Now, there's a couple of complementary, of course, ways. Yes. There is, of course, the SDGs as well, and SDG 10.7, 10.7 is linked to migration, has been tackled as sort of migration. So that has been another approach, soft approach. You know, that brings us into the big argument how effective have the SDGs been. One thing one can certainly say is that states, to some strange reason, love goals much more so than they love rights. They tend to try to diminish their rights responsibilities, but they are quite happy, oddly enough, to accept goals and to then compete with each other on who's sort of, you know, a millimeter better than the other on goals. Yeah, so one could argue that the SDGs, including on the migration front, have made a huge revolutionary difference, but they resonated with states, possibly more so than a pure rights approach, which is a funny thing from a human rights perspective. Sorry. Yeah, right. And then I've already mentioned that the new EU Pact, I'm not going to talk about this, is not about the EU, but of course it's another very comprehensive attempt to forget the Dublin regulation fallout during the post 2015, of course, and you know, resonate in a sense, bring back. I mean, we've got some EU scholars here, bring back in a sense the EU on some similar line. when really, I think most member states don't actually want to be anymore on a similar line or on that line in any case. Not for that, but Felix is much more expert on this. So let's see how this is entangled with the human rights regime. I'm aware of my time, you know. So interestingly, we have, in a sense, from the refugee law side, we have since the 1990s, we have a certain what we could call, you know, remember in academia we have turns, so we have a human rights turn in refugee law, in religious studies. Why is that? Simply because of the limitations of the convention system. Once again, it's not, you've seen, it's not just the convention, but virtually all other refugee instruments follow that fundamental and in that sense limited logic. So obviously, refugee lawyers soon discovered that there is a framework that is broader, that is more comprehensive, more universal, and not so much in terms of directly legalizing migration, but in terms of forcing states to extend protection to non-nationals in a broader way than this was before. And that's, of course, the human rights framework. So that's why we've seen this turn. And, you know, again, this is not a class on human rights, but, you know, these are just a cross-section of the main instruments that contain either the right to asylum, freedom of movement, etc. So a number of cross-border migration relevant stipulations. So this is very well anchored since the Universal Declaration in 48 in international human rights law. We can also see that similar to the Global Compact on migration, most of these human rights instruments are actually quite widely accepted, including, it should be said, by the United States, still so. I mean, maybe they'll act to move out, but so far they haven't. You know? We have different, I'm not going to go into this for time reasons in a more detailed way, but of course I've just mapped here some ways in which framing migration through human rights has been working in practice. So on one hand, it's been used as an interpretive practice, and this is not to be underestimated. So I should say, for example, Latin America has really, I'm sure going to talk much more about this, really a pioneer and a vanguard on this. I mean, there is essentially a soft law refugee instrument in the Americas, the Cartagena Declaration, which is not a human rights treaty. Everyone thinks it's human rights treaty. It's not a human rights treaty. It's a refugee treaty, and it's not even directly up. I mean, it doesn't create binding obligations, but it's essentially been, through interpretation, absorbed into the Inter-American human rights system through the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Which is that, you know, you're just going to take the Cartagena Declaration as if it was simply a protocol or amendment to the Inter-American Convention, which is creative visual interpretation. You've seen not quite so radical, but similar moves on part of the European Court of Human Rights, for example. That's what's been happening. You know? There's also, and of course, what courts then have done, human rights courts, regional human rights courts in particular, is then on that basis expand the beneficiaries of the international protection very much towards this non-national context. Yeah. They've also been undoing some of the security and public order exceptions. Yeah, so we've queried that. They've generally expanded the rights portfolio applicable to non-nationals. Of course, they've generally simply accepted this issue as an issue of supranational litigation and agitation. And we shouldn't underestimate this. I mean, there is still now, because the EU has, of course, still not managed to join the European Convention of Human Rights. It has its own fundamental charter of the fundamental rights, but it's still not as an organization party to the European Convention. And that, of course, however, creates a very interesting protection competition, so to speak, at this moment between the European Court of Human Rights on one hand, and the the Tribunal of the European Court of, well, what used to be called the European Court of Justice. What's the full name now? It's Court of Justice of the European Union. Exactly. That's so. Exactly. Which is not really a human rights court at all, and the Strasbourg Court, the European Court of Human Rights, is sometimes, I think, quite visibly annoyed about the ECJ's, the Court of Justice of the European Union, assumption in a sense of the human rights brief, but of course in terms of especially these very toxic issues in the EU, for instance, on asylum processing, third-party rules, etc., has been, that's been quite a race to the top in a sense through this court competition. And you know, this is just, again, zooming out to the international, just a very broad, coming to my end already, you know, just a couple of landmark cases. I mean, you know, many international obviously will know the famous Syrian litigation from at the European Court of Human Rights already in the late 80s, but of course that's a sort of very sui generis migration enforced case. There are no, you know, no nationality case. But of course, there are some more recent ones. I mean, I don't even need to mention the ICJ, which is not listed here, advisory opinion on climate change. But then there is the very path-breaking ICJ, the American Court advisory opinion on climate change, which very directly, I'm sure Carol will talk about this, mentions migration. There is also, you know, on part of the Human Rights Committee, some of the treaty-based mechanisms. There is, especially in the climate change. I mean, climate change has proved in human rights / migration law to be a big door opener, because courts have been even more emboldened than they were before to interpret or bring migration issues into a human rights remedy through the whole climate change issue. Yeah? And well, some issues then for discussion. From a more narrow kind of human rights in migration perspective, I think there's three. One is, of course, the eternal thing of equality and non-discrimination. So to what extent does this principle apply to non-citizens, particularly non-discrimination on the grounds of nationality? So, you know, how far can human rights, the human rights regime really push the fundamental binary that we're dealing here, which is national, non-national, isn't it? Then, of course, the whole thing of so-called irregular migration, can irregular migrants expect full protection to regular migrants and for nationals involves law and practice. So this is again the issue, and that's of course the basis on which the whole ICE process has been unfolding to some extent. And then lastly, of course, the very toxic issue in Europe, at least, for example, about economic social rights to migrants. To what extent do migrants or, you know, which states have very proactive obligations to integrate migrants into sort of social systems, but then also, for example, educational systems. And lastly, basically the remaining kind of big issues, this resonates with, sorry, you can't see this. You can see it now. The big issues, yes, exactly, and I'm on borrowed time here. You know, we've seen the regime fragmentation, the non-refoulement, is the main I think border issue we're seeing. We have pushback is becoming sort of, in Europe at least, it's becoming sort of a fashionable practice. It seems hugely problematic. Then similarly, the externalization of borders and migration control, as you mentioned or hinted. So basically, many European governments, not of a necessarily right-wing persuasion, have held sort of panic meetings behind closed doors after the big Rwanda fallout, saying, you know, we don't want anything like the Rwanda fallout in the UK happening with us. So how can we do Rwanda without it being Rwanda, seemingly? So I think we are, unfortunately, even with moderate, centrist, social democratic governments, moving into a direction of doing kind of slightly reflex. Right, but the microphone did turn, but I am really one thing. And then you've got the whole thing of migrant labor, as I mentioned, climate change, the environmental frontier. Then, of course, the whole big issue that I haven't really talked about, technological surveillance and the borders, and this is a very big part of the EU Migration Pact, Eurodac, for example, etc. So this is a big thing which we haven't really even, you know, taken the measure of. And generally, of course, the big political aspect, which I find, I mean, coming back to this normative framing, you know, your reflections on, you know, where can the compact sort of develop to, and yesterday I think this was also brought up not in relation to migration. I don't think there is any chance right now that we're going to go sort of harden the compacts into a big migration treaty or a new convention. And so, of course, what this means is that migration lawyers will continue to draw on human rights law primarily, but that, of course, also will eventually come to its limits, and especially to the extent that human rights and migration will increasingly be entangled, that will itself probably, unfortunately, feed the political backlash, including the Syrian human rights. Anyways, thanks very much. This is us at the Venezuela-Brazilian frontier in 2018, where we surveyed the refugee situation there, and just before Carolina went up. So I'll hand over to her. Thanks very much.
You, Carol.
Well, thank you, Felix, Dorian, thank you, Kai, for the invitation, and all the team at PUC-Rio for such a lovely reception, and the participants of the Insured Project for allowing us to participate in the discussion and learning more about your results. So I'll try to zoom in into the Latin American and Brazilian aspects of the large migration and particularly refugee protection issues. So since yesterday, we've been discussing a lot about the crisis, multilateralism, and global institutions and boards. I think migrants, and here I'm talking particularly of vulnerable migrants in the context of what we now call, some call survival migration, others call mixed flows, and refugees are somewhat a constitutive element of this broader crisis, particularly in relation to the institutional capacity of multilateral institutions, in particular, for conflict resolution and policy coordination in complex emergencies. And I think this is reflected on one hand in the global figures on forced displacement, which have risen from 20 million in the mid-1990s to now over 120 million people worldwide, asylum seekers, refugees, and people in what we call refugee-like situations. It is also reflected in the growing inequalities linked to human mobility, as access to territory and asylum protection becomes increasingly restricted in developed countries, leading to the spatial containment of displaced populations in their regions of origin, mostly in peripheral and low-income countries. And this dynamic compounds, of course, the humanitarian needs of both displaced communities and host communities. At the same time, and in response to these challenges, international organizations devoted to migration and refugee issues have gained greater global presence, both politically and spatially, and despite being chronically underfunded, they have expanded their mandates as well as the populations and territories under their management. UNHCR, for instance, has increasingly extended its scope, and in recent years, as Gloria mentioned, particularly under the growing cloud of climate change, to include populations affected by disasters, as Vitória will study here, right? The floodings in Rio Grande do Sul and the increasing encroachment of migration and refugee institutions in assisting those populations. This expansion reflects the sharp rise in the number of internally displaced populations and the tightening restrictions on access to asylum worldwide. In most regions, the number of UNHCR's people of concern now surpasses the combined numbers of asylum seekers and recognized refugees, indicating pragmatic changes in how the protection regime operates on the ground through new subsidiary categories. Latin America has been a particularly fertile ground for both trends, the expansion of what we can call humanitarian space and the development of institutional innovations for political coordination and in this policy field. These have evolved through both formal and informal mechanisms with cascading effects at sub-regional and national levels. I will briefly present, of course, some regional initiatives that I think exemplify what can be described as the expansive policy coordination landscape, or what Peter Myers and I have some ages ago called a country of UNHCR, now it can maybe called a region of UNHCR, and discuss their implications for Brazil's humanitarian landscape. So before turning to specific examples, I might just make two preliminary remarks. First, of course, regional processes are embedded in and often reactive to global and national politics. A clear illustration of this concerns the extraterritorial impacts of restricted migration and asylum policies, particularly those implemented in North America and Europe. Such measures have generated cascading effects across Latin America, transforming countries into dangerous transit corridors, such as the Colombia-Panama route through the Darien Gap, or abruptly altering migration patterns in receiving states. In the case of Brazil, for example, we have seen a recent increase, sharp increase in the number of Cuban nationals arriving in Brazil and other South American countries in 2025. And this is a direct result from the closure of legal pathways of access to the United States. Second, contextual and often protracted crises have profoundly shaped population mobility across the region. So it's impossible to overstate the impact of the Venezuelan crisis on Latin America's humanitarian governance architecture. The scale and nature of the unprecedented inter-regional displacement, estimated today at around 7 million people over the past decade, have severely tested the capacities of both transit and receiving countries. This has become the largest migratory movement in the region's modern history. Most Venezuelans have sought refuge in South American countries. Colombia now hosts 2.8 million Venezuelans, Peru 1.66 million, and Brazil approximately 700,000. This protracted and large-scale displacement, combined with relatively weak and low institutionalized regional organizations, initially led to unilateral and improvised responses. In more recent years, however, it has given rise to coordinated efforts with potential medium and long-term effects on policy alignment in the region. And these coordination efforts have been spearheaded by international organizations, notably UNHCR and IOM, whose roles have expanded to include agenda setting, capacity building, policy support, local implementation, while also serving as intermediaries between governments, civil society, and international donors. From global funding to regional strategies and integration policies, UNHCR and IOM staff have become almost ubiquitous across Latin America's refugee protection landscape. A truly regional approach was only launched into 2018, with two main institutional innovations worth highlighting. The first one, the PUC-Rio process, initiated under Ecuador's leadership with the support of UNHCR and IOM, functions today as a regional technical forum to coordinate responses to the Venezuelan migration and refugee crisis. Brings together 13 Latin American countries and Caribbean countries, along with these UN agencies, to promote cooperation, develop mechanisms for socioeconomic integration, and facilitate access to documentation and services. Annual technical meetings have resulted in regional and domestic plans aimed at integrating Venezuelan refugees and migrants and aligning priorities across national agendas. The second innovation is the Regional Interagency Coordination Platform, known as Response for Venezuela, R4V, which today includes around 250 organizations, both governmental and non-governmental, donors, national and local governments across 17 Latin American and Caribbean countries. R4V serves as a broad coordination platform to ensure access to protection, basic services, self-reliance, socioeconomic inclusion. Produces annual regional response plans and conducts analysis, such as the refugee migration needs analysis that guides humanitarian and policy strategies across the region. By facilitating information exchange and negotiation, R4D has structured relationships between states, NGOs, and international donors, and has become the region's primary source of migration data, thereby strengthening international organizations' influence on policymaking. Over time, the platform has expanded its membership, fostered more intersectoral collaboration, strengthened advocacy and fundraising, and has reframed somewhat the crisis narrative to include not only Venezuelans, but now also other nationalities moving through shared migration corridors across South, Central, and North America. It has been pivotal in aligning the region with the global frameworks for orderly, safe, and regular migration, and in linking those governments to the global compacts, both on refugees and on migration. Brazil has been a belated but central player in this scenario, both as a site for international organizations' policy experimentation and as a hub for innovation in refugee participation and subnational policy coordination. The country currently hosts 880,000 refugees and people in need of international protection, so under the umbrella of the UNHCR's mandate, a sharp increase from our historical numbers. Between 2015 and 2024 alone, over 450,000 asylum applications were submitted. That's a huge number for Brazil. That's not a huge number. But largely due to the arrival of Venezuelans, fleeing the economic, social, and political instability in the country. In response, the Brazilian government established Operation Acolhida, or Operation Shelter or Welcome, in 2018, which was a large-scale initiative providing emergency assistance, documentation, and social integration for Venezuelan migrants and refugees. The central component of that operation was the interiorization strategy, which promoted voluntary relocation the border state of Roraima, up in the north, to the other Brazilian regions. By 2025, more than 140,000 Venezuelans have been relocated to over 1,000 municipalities in all regions of the country. And that has been an important pivot to make migration and refugee issues a national issue across Brazilian territory. Between 21 and 23, we carried out at UFMG, the Federal University of Roraima, a large-scale project with UNHCR, the United Nations Fund for Population, and UN Women on the integration of relocated Venezuelans in Brazil. And the results revealed a complex yet encouraging scenario. Access to documentation and public services was remarkably high, with almost all relocated individuals possessing some type of legal residence or refugee status in Brazil and benefiting from direct access to national health system. Of course, Brazil is a universal health system. School enrollment among Venezuelan children and adolescents, which is a big part of the Venezuelan process, since we're talking here about family migration. Those Venezuelans come within a family structured mobility. Was substantial. Over 78% of Venezuelan children were enrolled in school. And health outcomes was also generally positive, including high rates of prenatal care and vaccination coverage. So over 90% of Venezuelans had received, for example, 3 doses of the COVID-19 immunization. Nonetheless, significant challenges persisted. A considerable share of Venezuelans reported discrimination, xenophobia, food insecurity after relocation. Labor market outcomes improved for Venezuelans after relocation, but the average incomes of Venezuelan remained below the national average. Those living in shelters in Roraima were particularly vulnerable. So data was actually very bad for those in shelters up north, earning only a fraction of what is typical nationwide and in Roraima. Gender disparities were also pronounced. Venezuelan women earned less, faced higher unemployment, and were more often engaged in informal work. Still, relocated individuals tended to experience better social and labor conditions than those who remained in shelters. So overall, I would say the findings confirmed some of the positive effects of Brazil's emergency relocation program, while revealing enduring inequalities shaped by gender and regional disparities. The data also pointed to the urgent need to integrate migration into national social policies, such as education, housing, health, and employment, and to strengthen coordination among federal, provincial, and local governments. Enhancing social participation, promoting gender-responsive policies, ensuring long-term local integration were also essential steps forward. Many of these challenges stem from the absence, in the case of Brazil, of a unified national coordination framework. Efforts to address this were undertaken in 2013, the first national conference on migration, refugee, and stateless in Brazil. And after a long run decade hiatus in 2024, we had the second national conference, which fostered dialogue among government, civil society, and migrant and refugee communities and leadership. This process culminated in the establishment of a comprehensive national policy for migration, refugee, and statelessness, result of this broad participatory movement that included also researchers, public officials, some colleagues here at PUC-Rio who were present at many of these events. And at the core, the new policy seeks to basically coordinate government and societal actors by framing migration, refugee, and statelessness as cross-cutting issues that demand collaboration. It's also grounded in a perspective that has gained ground in the last 40 years, since redemocratization of a human rights tradition that was only belatedly incorporated in issues related to migration in Brazil, to promote local integration and social inclusion through equal access to services and employment, and improving data systems for evidence-based policymaking. The national policy was approved this past October, marking this shift from a more fragmented and reactive approach from a coherent rights-based framework for migration and refugee governance in Brazil. And finally, approaching my conclusion, just a brief note on resettlement, refugee resettlement, that has long been hailed as an important global solution to refugee situations. Historically, resettlement programs in Latin America have had very limited reach. Latin America has not been a region for refugee resettlement. But Brazil has taken a pioneering step in this field through its resettlement and community sponsorship initiative. So there is a new private sponsorship initiative emerging. More than 50 civil society organizations are currently involved in the name of the policy is the Brazilian Community Sponsorship Program for Afghans. So it's for Afghan refugees, created in September 2023. This innovative initiative enables direct civil society participation in the reception and integration of Afghan individuals in need of international protection with technical support from UNHCR and other land. So although it's still too early to fully, assess the impact of these initiatives, they already represent, I think, a significant achievement and a rare moment of progress in an otherwise challenging and dire global landscape for migration and refugee issues. Despite enduring difficulties in protection and integration, Latin America and Brazil in particular stand out as, I think, good examples of how international organizations can assume innovative roles during protracted crises, shape new governance mechanisms at both regional and local levels. The region's approach reveals a distinctive combination of adaptability and solidarity in responding to the complexity of mobility. And Brazil has certainly emerged as a regional laboratory for such policy innovations,
And as migration continues to transform the region's demographic, economic, and political landscape, it's our central task here to ensure that these governance frameworks remain not only responsive to crisis, but also capable of fostering a rights-based integration for these groups. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolina. Really, I thought, yeah, everyone's started. It's been really informative. The panel, I think for myself, my experience with refugees is only on family history and very micro on the personal level, but we were able to visit PUC-Rio with another project, and I also had a little bit of experiences in Germany volunteering and Caritas and stuff, and it's really striking to see the difference. Right, this idea that when people come here to Brazil, they are human beings with rights to be realized by the state, is really something strikingly different. And it was striking in doing the report for the project as well, to see sort of how even some of the questions had to always be adapted a bit in order to fit the context, So there's definitely some differences there and some things to be learned from here. But in that sense, let me open it up to the floor and see if we have any questions. Yep. Oh yeah, over here, David. And Deborah.
Thank you for the panelists. Waiting to Carolina. My question goes to all the panelists. Public Services International is really concerned about helping workforce migration, helping care workforce migration, or helping care workforce migration, and from both there and an ethics perspective, concern both the workers that migrate and with the health systems of the countries from origin that take forever to graduate, educate a nurse or a teacher or a therapist or dentist. And there is also this global south dynamic, global north countries looking for professionals in global south countries, and public services international is concerned both with those health systems and with professionals that go to those countries. And of course, we follow the updates on the compact and the multilateral institutions that work in this regard. And I'd like your thoughts on, recent developments, and what have you seen in terms of any trends that have been going on? Here in Brazil, we have this important example of this bilateral agreement that almost came to force between Brazil and Germany, that was being brokered by the PUC, which is the Federal Council of Nursery, that does not represent the workers. It's a professional regulatory body that would not involve the Ministry of Labor, that would not involve the Ministry of Health, but the government of Germany and the Federal Council of Nursery in Brazil. So, with the several difficulties with the professional arriving in Germany, in terms of income, in terms of not validating their the status here in terms of the technical expertise. They wouldn't arrive as nurses, they would arrive as caregivers. So these kind of things. And of course, we understand that there are non-binding measures in the multilateral instruments. How can we turn them binding, thinking about those bilateral agreements? And the last thing I wanted to ask is about the activities of those private corporations that are trying to look for workers. Look for is a very subtle way of putting it. Workers in the global south countries and taking them to the global north countries. Something we try to think about regulating those activities and those enterprises.
I was just hoping you could expand, all of you could expand a bit more on discussions, negotiations, present, future of climate refugees. Fundamental topic. Being in Australia, that's all people are focused on in the Pacific.
Three at a time.
Hello, good afternoon. First of all, thank you for the seminar. It was great and very enlightening. I have a question. I'll look at my phone because I wrote it down, must forget it. But my question is, regarding these, policies trying to the combat of immigration, combat to immigration, policies against immigration that countries like the US and some far-right regimes around the world in Europe have been doing and speaking a lot of recently. To which point, to what point do you believe that these policies actually grant protection? And when do they actually become tools to surveillance, control and violation of human rights and sovereignty? That's basically my question. Thank you.
Maybe just before today as well, take up into this one.
I think one question was already done. If you could talk a little bit more about surveillance, foreign and civics, and the other one to Carol, if you have more information about integration of refugees into the university system, because I know there is a national policy, and I had some experience at the Milan, the University of African Integration. There are a lot of Haitians there. If you have some more information to share about that, how the universities are doing this, and
So maybe take it in reverse order and then start with Carolina.
I'll also take the questions in reverse order then. And so in relation to universities, it's actually interesting because we were part of the GAIN, which is the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network, the group of universities in Brazil and worldwide. We submitted some pledges for the Global Compact on refugees. You know, UNHCR has this, one of the goals is to have 15% of the young refugee population in higher education by 2030. And Brazil has played a central role in achieving that goal, precisely because of the knowledge shares. So right now we're a group of over 50 universities in Brazil, and under the Global Compact, it has been sold by UNHCR as a good practice, a best practice. So now we're going global from Brazil to the globe. There are universities in the UK, in Italy, in Ethiopia. I think there are a couple in Indonesia joining. So it's a growing group now. PUC-Rio is part of that process. And one of the ideas is precisely to make universities part of, or understand universities as part of civil society and as a central element of local integration. So in the case of Brazil in particular, public universities have been important service providers, both in terms of health. So public universities have hospitals that provide access to all sorts of services to the population, mental health clinics, psychology departments, language training, and as well as degree. And that brings me to the discussion. The recognition of higher education degrees, that's a responsibility legally in Brazil, that is a competence of public universities. So the segregated genetic chairs have been doing this work for over 2 years now. I think there is always an annual report, and the numbers are I think, really striking in terms of what universities have been doing for migrant and refugee populations here. In relation to degrees, I think it's an important bottleneck in the integration policy. But Brazil is also an interesting case for that because we have a digitalized and national system for degree validation and credentials. So all universities now go through a central platform, and universities have a somewhat autonomy, a bit of autonomy to decide on how those credentials will play out. So we have had many degree validations for several areas. The health sector, the health areas are perhaps the most sensitive ones. And in part because in Brazil, they need to know about the universal health system in Brazil. So part of the training requires knowledge of how the system operates. So we have had experiences of doctors, nurses, health technicians who have had their credentials recognized, but they had to do some hours of coursework within universities to fulfill the requirements. So there are actually very interesting cases in relation to degree credentials in the health area. Another bottleneck problem relates, for example, to Cuban nationals. There are now over 20,000 asylum requests by Cubans awaiting decision in the National Committee for Refugees, and many of whom are health workers who came to Brazil under Mais Médicos and certain regional cooperation bilateral schemes established by the Brazilian government, who don't want to go back once those schemes ended and haven't found yet mechanisms. But I think the Brazilian government is on track to finding a solution for those cases, and perhaps. And another interesting point is that the Brazilian refugee law allows for flexibility in relation to documents required for access to basic rights in Brazil. So that allows us to recognize degrees without certain certifications, without translation, in the case of people with recognized refugee status. So that's also an interesting, I think, element of the Brazilian policy. In relation to climate refugees, that's a tricky element, the discussion in Brazil. We do have a few colleagues, André Pacheco, we just finished a 3-month course and discussion with UNHCR, IOM, and colleagues at different universities with migrant and social activists on how to better tackle that agenda in relation to Brazil and the region. Some of the consultation process, the result is now going to be presented next week in Belém. The Fórum dos Povos, in those, on those venues. I think that came after Rio Grande do Sul. That was a real huge driver for UNHCR now with IOM to actually put a strong feet on that discussion in Brazil. So now they're turning to, for example, displacement in mining regions, in development projects, in large-scale disaster situations. So, for example, in the case of Maceió, the Braskem disaster, there is also a discussion about participating there. So I think the momentum is for the encroachment of displacement, let's say, disaster displacement into the broader architecture of migration and refugee response. I think that's the way it's going. But Brazil also has a specific national plan for disaster response. There are other actors that need to be articulated in that agenda. So yet to be seen.
Working, yeah. Thanks very much for the questions. I'll be in the middle anyway, so reverse order or order doesn't matter. So I'll take the take the climate refugee question first and then join up the two other questions. Just to complement, I think Carolina already presented the Brazil picture, and of course, on climate displacement, Latin America as a region is again very much in the lead. Certainly, from a human rights perspective, you have that path-breaking advisory opinion from the International Court earlier this year, preceding the International Court advisory opinion, and that had a focus, amongst others, on migration, environmental migration. You have for quite some time, you have regional forums on migration that are not part of the human rights machinery, but have applied and extended temporary protection measures, in part for people claiming to flee from disaster-related / environmental. For example, Haitian, exactly. And a number of states have incorporated that into their national states in Latin America, into their national legislations quite far. I mean, to be honest, even further than Brazil. So Brazil isn't even on the total front line when it comes to national implementation of accepting this. Now, worldwide, of course, I mean, I think one has to kind of, again, put this in the context that, again, in the current political world climate, at least, I think it's very, very unlikely that we're going to see a legal instrument on environmental migration. And as long as we don't have a legal instrument, we're stuck in that same gap that I talked about. So on one hand, we have sort of a baseline refugee regime that doesn't really accommodate environmental migration because it's just hard to track to individual persecution. And this, of course, is also, so states generally in the region or outside have found it easier to accommodate direct early, or so-called early onset disaster migration. So something happens, everyone knows about it, people are displaced, people get, are accommodated. But one big issue in climate refugee issues, in climate migration issues, is slow onset. In fact, this in the Human Rights Committee, concerning Australia, the TETOA decision, which was funny, sort of, saying, okay, so maybe in 10 years from now or in 20 years from now, we'll all be able to deal with this much better. So, which is why the right is really infringed today. But of course, that was, in a sense, just a foreshadowing of the challenge, because the challenge is with slow onset, states will be very likely saying, well, are you really, who done it instead, and can you really pinpoint this to, slow environmental degradation? Is that really something that we can sort of admit as a cause for any kind of claim for asylum or temporary stay, etc.? So that's the general, I think, challenge. And the same thing is then, so I think what we've seen is, especially in Latin America, but to a certain extent outside, is to employ human rights to kind of incorporate that particular situation of environmental displacement. But again, the question will be in the mid-long term whether that is sustainable both legally, because ultimately the human rights framework isn't really made for that particular thing. And I should like, this is a different issue, but I didn't mention this, but I should like to draw attention back to that. So the human rights turn has been very positive. Many refugee lawyers have espoused it, but it has also drawbacks. So, for example, during the pandemic, if you take a place like Brazil, socially highly stratified, lots of people in precarious living situations, then you throw in sort of some kind of natural disaster like a pandemic. So, and you throw in migrants with everyone else who is primarily affected, you kind of completely lose sight of that specificity. So, for the UN buffs among you, that would be the targeting. So you can't really target very easily human rights. They apply to anyone in a particular jurisdiction. And so for any situation where you kind of need to target migrants and or refugees, the human rights framework has not so much limitations, but it will not distinguish very much between candidates. So just very briefly, Carolina also commented on this, on the labor issue. This is, of course, very interesting. We had recently sort of some private opportunity to talk to a Brazilian diplomat in the formally slated in the German embassy in Brazil, so accompanied that process. And apparently the Brazilian side was not very happy with it at all. And I think it shows very much sort of this, that I hinted, say, maybe in the US it's now even more kind of majestic. So you know, if someone is worth $100,000 extra, a foreign worker, you can hire him or her, yeah, but if not, you just kind of send you ice essentially. Yeah? And the Europeans try to do it more subtly, but I think it's a similar logic. But I think what we're seeing is those countries that are destinations of migration, they don't really entirely, I mean, I think it's a dilemma. And I think this would be really interesting to discuss in a wider context, also with democracy and stuff, because it's a fact, it's a demographic fact that most European countries, for instance, have a negative work demographic, etc. They will need especially qualified labor. But it's a fact that it's entirely not so much ignored, but sidelined or inverted even by political rhetoric right now. So those populations that there are just are not willing by a certain majority at least at the moment to accept the fact that you will need to, that you can only deal with labor shortage through legalized migration. So I think what happens is, in the German case, it's very, that you describe is, of course, is very typical of that. So on one hand, you have, yeah, we kind of really need nurses and maybe even some doctors. On the other hand, you've got the German Doctors Association, which is all, you know, in Brazil, you have this wonderful term, reserva do mercado, which is basically just a racket in a sense, you know, let's just not admit too many people. I mean, all of Europe's traditional trades were organized by limiting access and stratifying, you know, decision about who can exceed. So this is deep down in the DNA of many professions, not just in Europe, but generally, historically. So obviously, on one hand, you've got that logic. So yes, we need some nurses and doctors, but on the other hand, we don't really want to give up that kind of reserved kind of logic and total control over who can become a doctor or what, yeah, and where you can practice. I mean, this applies to Germans themselves. You can't just say, I'm a doctor, when I open up shop here, but you know, there's loads of restrictions, etc. Similarly with lawyers, so many of the qualified professions have that limitation. Yeah? So on one hand, you need labor force there, but on the other hand, you don't really want to offer contracts on the same terms as national, you know, non-national. As you said, I mean, there's a downscale. And even in symbolic politics, I mean, I think it's quite enraging, certainly in the European scene, when even advocates, I mean, this is a pragmatic choice of blaming the advocates, but even advocates for migration often in sort of the more advertising, propagandistic aspects, they highlight how important migration is to take care of the elderly. In effect, yeah. So, like, you know, let's have a Syrian fully qualified brain surgeon, you know, take care of an elderly person that's just moving around the wheelchair. It's kind of that logic that still very much prevails. And I think it's an electoral, it's a logic that comes, it's much more situated in electoral demographics and who gets to vote, who doesn't get to vote, and what politicians can do. So that's the issue, I think, it's almost in parallel to being a legal issue.
Thank you very much for all the questions. I'll deal with them in order. Firstly, a lot has been said, of course, on your question, but just when you asked about are there any innovative policies being developed, here the EU would very much say, yes, we are doing something. The EU is proposing, piloting a policy that they call talent partnerships, which is essentially agreements between, well, the European Union and the member states. The member states need to be involved because the European Union on labor migration doesn't have competence. Right? So the member states can simply say this year I'll take 0 and 0, so they have to be involved. And they then negotiate with a third country and the private sector, and they try to come up with some sort of mechanism that would work. This would include, for example, training paid for by the Europeans already in the country of origin, to then let people temporarily come to the European Union to work and gain experience and eventually go back. Now, this sounds very good. It's very difficult to negotiate these things because, of course, the different actors have very different priorities. The EU and member states will always insist on conditionality, right? And so they will say, yes, we'll fund all of this, but then only if you readmit people in our territory, right, of your nationality. Whereas of course the private sector will be completely against any conditionality because they say, if I pay millions for this stuff, then I want a guaranteed labor force. And if it depends on political, interactions between the EU and this country, this becomes very problematic. An additional problem is this is incredibly underfunded. So there is one with Pakistan, for example, and the entire budget of the program is 3 million euros. Yeah, that's not going to achieve anything, right? But so there is something. You could also say it's kind of in line with what the GCM is trying to do, but it's very limited and it's very underfunded. So that was my point on that. On the point of climate reviews, I don't know what to add. I think it was clarified, right? The current legal framework definitely does not cover these people, at least not the refugee framework. There is, of course, arguments being made on the human rights law, the right to life, the prohibition of anyone degrading treatment. You could make these arguments, but that's, the Human Rights Council has been very reluctant to accept anything. An additional point there, by the way, is not so much coming from, refugee lawyers also have a bit of a problem with this because they think it might undermine the attention for the real refugees, so to speak. And also in the political sciences, in a previous colleague in Maastricht, Henk Hans, he's got one in the Netherlands, he wrote a book, How Migration Really Works, which talks about the myths surrounding migration. And one of his points is actually that the threat of climate refugees, if you want to call them that, is much smaller than what we all think it is. Now, that's not necessarily my opinion, but it is a very interesting reading to do, so I can recommend that. I'll leave that there. And finally, the question from the students on these policies, when are they illegal, essentially, right? The policies against migration. First of all, and notes just to make it clear, this is already an interesting rhetorical point in the sense of, right, we in this context, we always talk about, I am for migration and I am against migration, whereas of course, an economist never said, I am for the economy or I'm against the economy. Or a healthcare worker never said, I'm in favor of health or I'm against health. But in migration, this is what we do, right? So that's already an odd thing. Regarding the legality or the illegality, we can't go into details. The main central point here is the prohibition of non-refoulement, right? The central protection, Article 33 of the Refugee Convention, which simply put says, I cannot return people to a place where their life of freedom is threatened, which de facto means an obligation of entry. So in my presentation, I mentioned before, labor migrants do not have a right of entry, but refugees do have a right of entry, at least temporarily, right? Because if I cannot return somebody to a place where their life of freedom is threatened, that must mean either I let them in and give them protection, or I temporarily let them in and I see whether there is a third country that should be responsible for this person. But regardless, you must let them in. This is why refugees get so much more attention than labor migration. Because states realize this is the one exception to our sovereignty, whereas on labor migration, we are still fully in charge. And final point on that, just on your question specifically on the illegality, the prohibition of non-refoulement is an absolute right, meaning there are no limitations possible in a situation of crisis, in a situation of war, with the right to asylum. That's not the case, by the way, and the European Commission is currently looking into incredibly limiting the right to asylum, yet somehow still complying with non-refoulement. I will look at legal verification. You can ask it, you can ask in the break. But that's what I would say on that. Finally, the question on surveillance that was asked. I do not have a lot to add there, so maybe Florian does, if there's any time. The only thing I can very much recommend is the work by Nyovi Valuva. She used to be a Queen Mary's. I don't know if she's there anymore, but if you Google her, you'll find out she has written detailed stuff on what's happening in the new Pact on Migration side of the European Union's new policies on how this works. The only thing I can say about it, it is the central way that this is what the Northern and Western European countries run, right? They want no secondary movements. The country you arrive in is responsible for your asylum application. That will still be the case under the new framework. So that problem is not addressed at all. And this is what you use, right? So you fingerprint people, you take eye scans of people, and then you know, right? They arrive in the Netherlands, my country, we take your fingerprint, we see you initially arrived in Greece, we send you back. So this is all very much used as the prevention of secondary movement, or then for an view of anything to add. Thank you.
But no, not really that much. I mean, it's just a very new context. This is now a much studied sort of field. I think the one thing I would like to add is that I find it increasingly difficult to disentangle the debate on surveillance methods vis-a-vis migration to surveillance methods vis-a-vis everyone else or everyone essentially, because I think this is just moving in very, very fast. I think much faster than we are actually really accompanying. And yes, the migration context is always held out because it's one context where this can be communicated with what governments think is a degree of legitimacy. Yes, we're kind of making sure no one, we're keeping track on people, etc. But I honestly think that the technologies employed are not of interest only in migration control at all anymore. And I think there's kind of a fusion of the two contexts. Yeah.
Fantastic. I think we finished the panel perfectly on time. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you.